In 1936, a mother in Ohio fed 6 people on 11 cents a night, and nobody at that table knew they were poor. That was the magic of the American family dinner. Number 47 showed up on more kitchen tables than any casserole ever sold. Number 12 was born in wartime rationing and outlasted the war by 40 years. And number 1 fed a nation before we quietly forgot it existed. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 100 forgotten family dinners. Number 100, milk toast. This was the meal that lived at the very bottom of the week, the one that came out when the money was gone and payday was still 3 days off. A mother would tear day-old white bread into rough pieces, drop them into a bowl, and pour warm milk over the top. The milk thickened with a little butter and softened with a spoon of sugar and a dusting of nutmeg. That was the whole thing. The bread swelled soft, and the milk turned it into something close to porridge, warm and gentle and easy to swallow. A loaf cost 16 cents in 1952, and a quart of milk about 21 cents, so a family of 6 ate supper for pocket change. But milk toast was more than thrift. It was the meal you made for a sick child home from school, for a grandmother with no teeth left, for a father worn thin from a double shift who could not face anything heavier. It asked nothing of the person eating it except that they be gently fed. Nobody wrote it down because nobody thought it counted, but in 1,000 quiet kitchens, it was the taste of getting through. Number 99, creamed peas on toast. Before frozen dinners and drive-thrus, this was how a mother put a hot plate in front of her children in 5 minutes flat with almost nothing in the house. She started a white sauce in a saucepan, butter melted and flour whisked in until it smelled nutty, then milk poured slowly and stirred until it thickened into a silky cream. Into that went a can of peas drained of their liquor, or a handful shelled fresh from the garden in summer, warmed through until they turned chopped and sweet. She ladled the whole thing thick and steaming over 2 slices of toast and set it down. The toast underneath went custardy, where the sauce soaked in, and the peas gave it just enough substance to feel like a real supper. A can of peas cost a dime. The milk and flour were already on the shelf, and the meal came together on a single burner without heating the whole kitchen. Farm wives and city mothers alike leaned on it hard, especially on nights when the icebox held nothing but staples. It filled a plate that had nothing else on it, and it did the job every single time. Number 98, fried cornmeal mush. This dish began the night before when a cook boiled cornmeal in salted water until it thickened into a heavy porridge, then poured it into a loaf pan and set it on the cold windowsill or in the cellar to firm up overnight. By morning, it had set solid enough to turn out and slice. Those thick slabs went into a hot skillet slicked with bacon grease, where they sizzled and browned until the outsides shattered into a golden crust, while the insides stayed soft and creamy. Drizzled with molasses, maple syrup, or sorghum, or just eaten with a pat of butter and salt, it was a hot, filling supper built on a nickel's worth of cornmeal. Across the rural Midwest and the mountain South, cornmeal was the cheapest thing in the pantry, half the price of wheat flour, and it stretched a family's food budget further than almost anything else. Fried mush was leftovers reborn. The porridge nobody wanted for breakfast turned into something crisp and worth waiting for by supper. It carried people through the Depression and the lean post-war years, and today it has vanished so completely that most Americans have never even heard of it. Number 97, tomato gravy over biscuits. Long before sausage gravy became the celebrated star of the Southern breakfast table, tomato gravy was the everyday workhorse that fed families on almost nothing. A cook started with bacon grease saved in a can on the back of the stove, stirred in a spoonful of flour, and cooked it low until it turned the color of a brown paper bag. Then a can of whole tomatoes went in, crushed by hand into the roux, along with a splash of water, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar if the tomatoes ran sharp. It simmered until it thickened into a rich, bright, savory gravy the color of brick, and it got poured thick over split homemade biscuits, still warm from the oven. The acid of the tomatoes cut clean through the richness of the lard biscuits beneath, and a dime's worth of canned tomatoes fed the whole table. It was breakfast most mornings in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and just as often it was supper when there was nothing else. The flour and lard came from the 50-pound bags in every Southern pantry. It appeared on tables nearly every day that was not Sunday, and now it has all but disappeared. Number 96, red-eye gravy and country ham. This was the breakfast that launched a working man into a long day in the fields or the mill and kept him going until noon on almost nothing. A thick slice of salt-cured country ham went into a screaming hot cast-iron skillet, where it fried until the edges curled and browned and the fat rendered out. Then, while the pan still sizzled, the cook poured in a cup of strong black coffee, sometimes with a spoon of the ham's own drippings, scraping up every caramelized bit stuck to the bottom. The liquid bubbled and reduced into a thin, reddish, deeply savory gravy that got its name from the way it looked, a red eye staring up from the pan. The bite of the bitter coffee cut through the heavy salt of the cured ham and made something that tasted almost balanced. Men sopped it up with biscuits, chasing every drop across the plate. It needed nothing the pantry did not already hold, just ham, coffee, and a hot pan, which is exactly why poor Southern families relied on it for generations. Country ham hung in every smokehouse, and coffee was cheap, and together they made a breakfast that felt like plenty. Number 95, sausage gravy over biscuits. This was the meal that turned a half-pound of the cheapest breakfast sausage into a spread that fed a whole hungry family. The cook crumbled the sausage into a cast-iron skillet and browned it hard, breaking it into little bits, letting the fat render out into the pan. Then a good dusting of flour went in and cooked into the grease until it smelled toasty, and milk got poured over, slowly stirred and stirred until the whole thing thickened into a thick, creamy, peppery gravy studded with sausage. It got ladled generous over hot split biscuits and hit the table steaming. A pound of sausage cost little, and stretched with flour and milk, it fed 6 people until they could not eat another bite. It was heavy in the way only fat and starch can be, and it sat in your stomach like ballast against a hard day of physical labor, the kind of breakfast that meant you would not think about food again until the sun was high. Across the rural South and the working farms of the Midwest, this was the standard, the meal that got people out the door and into the work. Diners sell it now for a small fortune, but it was born of poverty and thrift. Number 94, grits and gravy. In the Deep South, grits were not a side dish or a trendy brunch order. They were the foundation of the day, the cheap, filling starch that a family could always afford. Stone-ground corn simmered slow in salted water until it turned soft and creamy, thickening into a bowl of pale, warm comfort. A pat of butter melted into it, and then a spoonful of whatever gravy was left in the skillet from the morning's meat, red eye, sausage, or plain milk gravy got stirred right in. That was supper or breakfast or both. It cost almost nothing. A bag of grits ran a few cents and lasted for weeks, and it cooked itself while the cook dressed for the day and got the children moving. On a cold Carolina morning, it warmed a person from the inside out, sticking to the ribs and holding hunger off for hours. For families who could not afford much else, grits were the great equalizer, the dish that appeared on nearly every table across the coastal South. It was humble to the point of invisibility, and that humbleness is exactly why it slipped out of memory once folks could afford to eat something fancier. Number 93, fried apples and side pork. This was mountain supper, the kind of plate an Appalachian family put together when the smokehouse and the orchard were all they had. Side pork, the salt-cured belly of the hog, got sliced thick and laid in a hot skillet where it fried until the fat rendered and the meat crisped at the edges. Then, into all that good pork fat left in the pan, went tart apples cut in wedges, cooked down slow with a little sugar until they softened and caramelized into something sticky and golden and deeply sweet. The salt of the pork against the sweet of the apples made a plate that felt like abundance even when the cupboard was nearly bare. Apples came free from the trees in the fall and got dried or stored in the cellar to last the winter, and every family that kept a hog had side pork put up in salt. Served with a wedge of cornbread to catch the juices, it was a full, satisfying meal made entirely from what the land and the smokehouse provided. It carried mountain families through hard winters and lean years, and it tasted like the place they came from. Today it survives mostly in memory and old handwritten recipe cards. Number 92, scrapple. When a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer butchered a hog in the cold of November, nothing was allowed to go to waste, and scrapple was the proof. Every scrap of meat, the trimmings, the odd bits, the meat cooked off the head and bones, got simmered soft in a big pot of broth. Then, cornmeal and buckwheat flour were stirred in to bind it all together, seasoned heavily with sage, thyme, black pepper, and marjoram until it thickened into a stiff mush. The mush got poured into loaf pans and set out to firm up solid overnight in the cold. The next morning, the loaf was turned out and sliced a 1/4 inch thick, and each slice went into a hot skillet to fry until both sides turned deep, mahogany brown and crisp. Served alongside fried eggs with a drizzle of maple syrup or a spoonful of apple butter, it was the breakfast that launched working men into the fields and factories of Lancaster County and the Delaware Valley. A whole loaf cost about 18 cents and lasted a family the better part of a week. It was thrift and ingenuity pressed into a pan, and today you can find it at a handful of specialty butchers in Pennsylvania and almost nowhere else. Number 91, head, cheese, and souse. This was the ultimate proof that a poor family wasted nothing off a hog, not even the head. After butchering, the head was simmered for hours until every bit of meat fell away tender from the bone, and that meat was picked clean, chopped, and seasoned hard with vinegar, salt, pepper, onion, and whatever spices the cook favored. Then it was packed into a mold and left to set because the natural gelatin cooked out of the head firmed the whole thing into a sliceable loaf without a drop of added gelatin. Cold, tangy, sharp with vinegar, and shot through with tender pork, it got sliced thin and laid on bread for a quick, no-cook supper. Souse was the same idea with even more vinegar, souring the loaf into something bright and bracing. German, Polish, and rural southern kitchens all made a version, because in a world where meat was precious and refrigeration scarce, the idea of throwing away a whole hog's head was unthinkable. It kept for a good while in a cold cellar and fed a family cheap. Squeamish modern eaters flinch at it now, but it was ordinary once, a frugal, flavorful supper that has slipped almost entirely out of the American kitchen. Number 90, fried bologna sandwiches. Every working-class kitchen in America kept a roll of bologna in the refrigerator because at 30 cents a pound, it fed a family for days and never spoiled fast. But a fried bologna sandwich was not the cold, limp thing you threw together for lunch. A mother cut the bologna thick, a good 1/4 inch, and made 2 or 3 small notches around the edge of each slice so the meat would not curl up into a cup when it hit the heat. Then those slices went into a hot cast iron skillet where they blistered and browned and puffed up, domed in the center, the edges crisping dark, the whole kitchen filling with a smell that brought children running from 3 rooms away. Laid on soft, white bread with a swipe of yellow mustard and maybe a slice of government cheese, it was a proper hot supper, not a snack, not an afterthought, but dinner. Men ate it after long shifts, kids ate it before school, and nobody felt any shame in it because up and down the block, everyone was eating the same thing. It was cheap, fast, and deeply satisfying, and it belonged to an era when a roll of bologna was a household staple. Number 89, fried Spam and eggs. When that little blue and yellow can showed up on shelves in 1937, it changed the way frugal families thought about meat. Spam kept for years without refrigeration, cost about 12 cents a can, and never spoiled no matter how lean the times got. A mother sliced it thick and laid the slices in a hot skillet where they fried until the edges caramelized brown and crisp and the surface turned glossy and golden. Served alongside fried eggs and bread or toast, it was a hearty, salty, satisfying supper that came together in minutes. Through the war years, when fresh meat was rationed and hard to come by, Spam became the protein that got millions of American families through, and long after the war ended, it stayed in the cupboard as insurance against a thin payday. There was a reliability to it that mothers trusted, a can that would always be there, always ready, always the same. It fed soldiers and it fed families, and for a whole generation the smell of Spam crisping in a skillet meant a warm meal was coming. It became a quiet punchline in later years, but for the people who depended on it, it was a lifeline. Number 88, Spam hash. This was the resourceful cook's answer to a half-empty refrigerator and yesterday's leftovers. A can of Spam got diced into small cubes and thrown into a skillet with cold boiled potatoes, also diced, and a chopped onion. All of it fried together in a little grease until everything crisped and browned and crusted at the edges. The potatoes soaked up the salt and fat of the Spam. The onion went sweet and soft, and the whole thing pressed down into the pan formed a golden crust on the bottom. Topped with a fried EGG, its yolk breaking golden over the top, it turned a pile of scraps into a genuine supper that felt like something. Frugal wives across the country kept a can of Spam in the cupboard precisely for nights like this, when the paycheck had run out, but the family still had to eat, and there was nothing fresh in the house. It cost almost nothing, used up leftovers that would otherwise have gone to waste, and put a hot, filling plate on the table. Like so much of the food born of thrift, it disappeared the moment families could afford to stop stretching every scrap, and the knack for it faded with the need. Number 87, deviled ham sandwiches. In a world before lunch, meat came sliced in plastic packages. A small can of deviled ham was a pantry treasure. Spiced, ground ham packed into a little tin that cost pennies and kept on the shelf indefinitely, it was insurance against an empty icebox. A mother would spread it thick onto soft white bread, sometimes with a smear of mustard, a leaf of lettuce, or a slice of pickle, and cut it into halves for the children coming home hungry from school. It was salty, savory, and spiced, just enough to feel like a treat, and one small can stretched to feed a whole table when nothing fresh was in the house. On the nights when the paycheck had thinned out and the garden was bare and the meat drawer was empty, deviled ham sandwiches were the reliable fallback that kept the family fed without a trip to the store. It required no cooking, no skill, and no money to speak of, which made it the perfect emergency supper. It appeared in lunch pails and after-school kitchens across the country for decades, humble and dependable. Today, the little can still sits on grocery shelves, but hardly anyone remembers when it was a genuine cornerstone of feeding a family cheap. Number 86, Welsh rarebit. It sounds like something off a fancy restaurant menu, but Welsh rarebit was Depression supper dressed up in a nicer name, a clever way to turn cheese and bread into a real meal on a night when meat was simply out of the question. The cook melted sharp cheese slowly in a pan with a little milk, a spoon of mustard, a shake of Worcestershire, and sometimes a splash of beer or ale, stirring until it turned into a smooth, glossy, savory sauce. That hot cheese got poured thick over slices of toasted bread, where it soaked in and pooled rich and golden. Served with maybe a slice of tomato or a few pickles on the side, it was filling, warming, and satisfying in a way that plain bread and cheese never could be. A little cheese went a surprisingly long way when melted into a sauce, which is exactly why thrifty families leaned on it, and the fancy name gave a poor supper a touch of dignity. It carried the whiff of British parlors and afternoon tea, but in American kitchens it was pure economy. It let a mother put something hot and rich on the table when the budget said meat was impossible, and for that, it earned its place on the weeknight rotation. Number 85, cheese soufflé. Every home economics teacher in America taught it, and thrifty wives leaned on it hard, because a cheese soufflé was the rare dish that looked like real effort and money while costing almost nothing at all. A little grated cheese, a few eggs, some milk, a spoon of flour, and a good arm for beating the egg whites were all it took. The cook made a simple cheese sauce, folded in the beaten yolks, then gently folded in the whipped whites, and poured the whole airy mixture into a buttered dish. Into the oven it went, where it puffed up tall and golden and dramatic, rising over the rim like something from a magazine. Brought straight to the table before it could fall, it turned an ordinary Tuesday into an occasion, an elegant main dish conjured from a handful of the cheapest ingredients in the kitchen. The trick was in the technique, not the expense, which is what made it such a gift to a family on a tight budget. It let a woman set down something impressive and feel like she was feeding her family well, even when the wallet said otherwise. Today, the soufflé has a reputation as a difficult, fussy restaurant thing, but it was once a thrifty housewife's reliable weeknight showstopper. Number 84, E.G.'s Golden. Rod. This was one of those dishes that turned a handful of eggs into a supper pretty enough to be proud of. The cook hard-boiled several eggs, then separated them, chopping the whites and folding them into a smooth white sauce made of butter, flour, milk, and milk. That creamy, egg-studded sauce got spooned generously over slices of toast. Then came the flourish that gave the dish its name. The cooked yolks were pressed through a sieve so they fell over the top in a fine, delicate, golden crumble that looked exactly like the yellow lace of a goldenrod flower in bloom. A few eggs and a little milk became a hot, filling meal for the whole family, and it looked far more elegant than its humble cost suggested. It was a favorite for using up eggs when the hens were laying well and money was tight, and church cookbooks from coast to coast listed it as a reliable, cheap, and cheerful supper. Children found the pretty golden top irresistible, and mothers loved how far it stretched. Now the name has faded almost entirely from American kitchens, and the dish along with it, remembered only by the oldest cooks who once made it on the nights when eggs were all there was. Number 83, creamed chipped beef on toast. The military called it by a cruder name, the initials of which stood for something unprintable, and the men who ate it on bases through 2 world wars carried the recipe home to their own kitchens. Thin slices of dried, heavily salted beef, the kind that came in small glass jars for about 35 cents, got torn into strips and stirred into a thick white sauce of butter, flour, bao, and milk. The saltiness of the cured beef seasoned the whole sauce without any extra effort, and the whole creamy, salty mixture got poured over white toast, which soaked it up and softened beneath the weight of it. It was fast, it was filling, and it cost well under $1 to put on the table. Every veteran who came home from Korea or the Second World War had eaten it for breakfast on some base somewhere, and mothers who had fed their families through rationing recognized it immediately as the kind of cheap, sturdy meal that got a family through. It appeared in American home kitchens throughout the 1950s as a weeknight supper, a quick lunch, and a Sunday breakfast. Today it lives on mostly in the nostalgic memories of old soldiers and in a few diners that still know how to make it right. Number 82, salmon patties. Before tuna took over as the default pantry fish, a tall can of pink salmon was the affordable protein that stretched across working-class kitchens all over America. A mother would drain the can, pick out the largest bones, and mash the salmon together with crushed saltine crackers, an egg, a little chopped onion, and sometimes a spoon of mustard. She shaped that mixture into patties and fried them in a skillet until both sides turned deep golden and the outsides crisped into a thin, crackling shell, while the insides stayed moist, pink, and almost creamy. The soft little bones in the canned salmon, mashed right in, added a dose of calcium that nobody thought about, but everybody benefited from, something doctors now specifically recommend for bone density. A tall can cost about $1 in the 1950s and made enough patties to feed a family, often with a couple left over for the next day's lunch. Served with creamed peas or stewed tomatoes and a wedge of cornbread, salmon patties were Friday night supper in Catholic households and plenty of others, a meal that felt like something you might order at a diner. Children who swore they hated fish ate them without a second thought. Number 81, salmon loaf. The same humble, dependable can of pink salmon that made patties could be stretched even further into a whole baked loaf that sliced up handsome enough for company. The cook mashed the salmon, bones and all, together with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, a little milk, chopped onion, and seasoning, then pressed the mixture into a loaf pan and baked it until it set firm and golden. Often, a creamy white sauce, sometimes brightened with a little lemon or dill or a handful of peas, got poured over the top or served alongside. Turned out and sliced, it looked like a proper roast, elegant and substantial, and it cost a small fraction of what actual roast would run. 2 cans of salmon, a bit of bread and egg, and a modest oven's worth of time produced a main dish that fed 6 people well, served with mashed potatoes and a vegetable from the garden. It appeared in women's club cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1960s, a reliable Sunday or company supper for families watching every penny. When canned tuna grew cheaper and fresh salmon became something you ordered in a restaurant, the salmon loaf quietly disappeared from the American table, taking its clever thrift with it. First pattern break. Here is where the real story begins. In 1934, a red and white can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup quietly changed how America ate dinner. Home cooks discovered you could dump it over anything, add a little milk and some leftovers, and pull a bubbling casserole out of the oven with no sauce making, No lumps and no skill required. Whole cookbooks were built on that one can. It stretched a half-pound of meat into a family meal and hid the fact that money was tight. Food companies understood exactly what they were selling. It was not mushrooms, it was dignity in a can, a way to set down a hot dish and feel like a good provider, even when the wallet said otherwise. That single can fed more American children than any program ever did, and we forgot we ever needed it. Number 80, tuna noodle casserole. If any single dish defined the mid-century American weeknight, this was it. A can of tuna, a bag of egg noodles, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a handful of frozen peas, all stirred together in a dish and baked until it bubbled, with crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs scattered over the top for crunch. 12 minutes in the oven, and the whole kitchen smelled like every Wednesday night from 1955 to 1985. The cream of mushroom soup was the secret engine, turning a pile of pantry staples into something creamy, warm, and familiar without a lick of real cooking. It cost next to nothing. A can of tuna ran a dime, and it fed a family with leftovers that reheated just as well the next day. For a family stretched thin, it was the meal a mother could make with her eyes closed. No measuring, no timing, just open, dump, stir, and bake. The story goes that a widow in Nebraska always finished hers with a handful of crushed potato chips on top, saying the crunch was the only thing that made her feel like she was eating a real dinner and not just surviving. Her neighbors started bringing her chips, and then their own bowls, and a casserole accidentally cured a little loneliness. Number 79, creamed tuna on toast. When there were no noodles in the house and no time to bake a casserole, the tuna went straight into a white sauce and got spooned over toast instead, and supper was on the table in 5 minutes. The cook made a quick roux of butter and flour, whisked in milk until it thickened, then folded in a drained can of tuna and a handful of peas, warming it all through until it turned creamy and rich. Ladled hot over 2 slices of toast, it soaked in and turned the bread soft underneath while staying substantial on top. 1 pan to wash, a can that cost a dime, and a meal that asked almost nothing of a tired cook. It was the supper a mother could pull together in the dark after a double shift without a moment's thought, the kind of reliable, cheap, no-fuss dinner that kept a family fed on the hardest days. There was nothing glamorous about it, and nobody ever bragged about serving it, but it did exactly what it needed to do. It filled hungry stomachs, it cost almost nothing, and it took 5 minutes. In an age of convenience food and takeout, this quiet little dish has faded from memory entirely, remembered only by the people who grew up on it. Number 78, codfish cakes. In Catholic households and all across New England, Friday meant no meat, and salt cod was the answer that had fed coastal families for generations. The dried, heavily salted cod had to be soaked overnight, sometimes with the water changed once or twice to draw out the brine and rehydrate the fish. Then it was flaked and mixed together with mashed potato, a beaten egg, a little onion, and pepper, shaped into cakes, and fried in a hot skillet until both sides crisped up golden brown. The potato stretched the fish, and a little went a long way, which mattered in kitchens where every ingredient had to earn its keep. The genius of salt cod was that it kept for months without any refrigeration at all, hanging stiff and dry until the day it was needed, which is exactly why generations of families relied on it before ice boxes and freezers were common. A plate of crisp, golden codfish cakes with a squeeze of lemon or a dab of tartar sauce was a satisfying, thrifty Friday supper that tasted far better than its humble origins suggested. As fresh and frozen fish became easy to buy, the ritual of soaking salt cod faded, and the codfish cake slipped quietly out of the weekly rotation. Number 77. Oyster stew. On the coast, and at Christmas time, this was the simple, almost magical supper that turned a handful of cheap shellfish into something that tasted like luxury. The cook gently warmed milk and a good knob of butter in a pot, careful never to let it boil, then slipped in a handful of shucked oysters, along with their liquor and a shake of salt and pepper. That was the entire recipe, nothing more. As the stew heated, the oysters plumped and their edges ruffled, and they gave up their briny sweetness into the milk, which turned silky and rich and faintly gray gold. A few cents of oysters, plentiful and cheap along the coasts before over-harvesting, became an elegant, delicate supper served in the good bowls, the kind of meal that felt like an occasion even in a modest kitchen. In many families, it was the traditional Christmas Eve supper, a warm, comforting bowl before a cold night, and the simplicity was the whole point. There was no flour, no thickening, no fuss, just milk, butter, and oysters, and the trick was knowing exactly when to pull it off the heat. As oysters grew scarce and expensive, this humble stew became a rare thing, and today it survives mostly as a holiday memory in old coastal families. Number 76. Fish sticks. When the freezer aisle arrived in grocery stores in the 1950s, breaded fish sticks became the busy mother's miracle, a dinner that required nothing but an oven and a few minutes. Frozen, breaded, and ready to bake, they came out of the box, went onto a sheet pan, and emerged crisp and golden with no thawing, no filleting, and no messy pan of hot oil. A squeeze of ketchup or a spoon of tartar sauce, a side of peas or macaroni, and supper was done. For a generation of overworked mothers, especially those who had taken jobs outside the home, fish sticks were a small liberation, a hot, protein-rich meal that even a tired parent could get on the table in 15 minutes flat. Just as importantly, children who swore they hated fish ate them by the handful because the crisp breaded coating hid everything they objected to, and no one at the table had to handle a raw, slippery fillet. They fit perfectly into the busy, modern, convenience-minded kitchen that food companies were busy building, and they became a Friday night fixture in households across the country. They still exist, of course, but the sense of them as a genuine dinner solution, a small, everyday miracle, has faded into the background of the freezer case. Number 75. Fried catfish. Down south, a mess of catfish pulled from the river or the farm pond was cause for something close to celebration, and frying them was a ritual all its own. The fish were cleaned and rolled in seasoned cornmeal, sometimes with a little flour mixed in, then dropped into a black cast-iron skillet or a deep pot of hot lard or oil, where they fried until the cornmeal crust turned deep golden and crackling crisp, and the flesh inside stayed sweet and flaky. Served with hush puppies, coleslaw, and maybe some fried okra or white beans, it was Friday night food, weekend food, the kind of meal that brought families and neighbors together on a porch or around a backyard table. And the beauty of it was the cost, which was almost nothing but a fishing line, a little patience, and an afternoon spent by the water. For rural Southern families, the river and the pond were a free grocery store, and a good catch meant a feast without a dollar spent. The smell of catfish frying in cornmeal batter is bound up in the memory of countless Southern childhoods, a smell that meant good times and full plates. It endures at fish camps and church fish fries, but the everyday home version has grown rare. Number 74. New England clam chowder. In the fishing towns and farm kitchens of the Northeast, Clam chowder was the reliable, warming supper that carried people through the long gray winters. The cook started by rendering a bit of salt pork or bacon in the bottom of a heavy pot, then softened onions in the fat before adding diced potatoes, chopped clams and their briny liquor, and enough milk to make it rich. It all simmered gently until the potatoes went tender and the whole pot thickened into a creamy ivory-white chowder flecked with tender clam and bits of pork. A can of clams from the store, or better, a bucket of them, dug fresh from the tidal flats, fed a whole family for pennies, since along the coast clams were there for the taking. Served with common crackers or oyster crackers, crumbled on top and a wedge of bread, it was a hearty, satisfying meal that stuck to the ribs on a cold night. Yankee families made it on Fridays, on stormy evenings, and whenever the clamming was good, and every cook guarded her own particular way of making it. It was thrift and comfort in a single bowl, drawn straight from the sea and the garden, and it remains one of the few dishes on this list that never quite went out of style, though the homemade version has grown rarer. Number 73, corn chowder. When the garden was done for the season and the freezer was empty, a Midwest farm wife could still put a golden, satisfying supper on the table with a couple of cans and a potato. She simmered a diced potato in a little water until tender, then added a can of creamed corn and a can of whole kernel corn along with a cup of milk, and let the whole thing heat through until it thickened into a sweet, velvety, golden soup. The creamed corn was the clever trick, acting as its own thickener so there was no roux to make and no worry about lumps. Some cooks crumbled a slice of bacon over the top, others added a pinch of cayenne or a pat of butter, but the base recipe needed nothing else to be a full and comforting meal. It cost almost nothing, kept the family fed through the lean winter months when fresh vegetables were a memory, and came together fast on a single burner. Canned corn lasted for years in the pantry, waiting patiently for the day it was needed, which made this the kind of meal a family could always fall back on. For anyone with diabetes concerns, the potato could be skipped, and the soup was still thick enough to eat with a spoon. It was humble, dependable, and now nearly forgotten. Number 72, potato soup, potato soup. On farms across the rural South and the Ozarks, potato soup was not a starter or a first course. It was the whole supper. The cook peeled and diced 5 potatoes and simmered them with a chopped onion in water or milk, along with a chunk of salt pork or fatback for flavor, until the potatoes were soft enough to break apart with the back of a spoon and thicken the broth into something creamy without a drop of cream. Salt and pepper went in at the end, and a splash of canned, evaporated milk, if the family had it, made the whole thing rich. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost pennies, or came free from the garden and the root cellar, and this soup fed everyone at the table for almost nothing. But potato soup had one advantage that mattered more than its cost. It was soft. For an old grandparent with bad teeth, missing teeth, or ill-fitting dentures, it was the difference between eating a proper supper and giving up on food altogether. The Depression generation rarely talked about dental care because most of them could not afford it, so they quietly adapted their cooking until everything was soft enough to eat, and potato soup sat at the center of that gentle adaptation. It kept the old and the young fed alike. Number 71, split pea soup with ham. This was the soup that stretched the very last value out of a ham bone, turning a scrap that would otherwise be thrown away into 2 days of dinners. After a Sunday or holiday ham was picked clean, the bone went straight into a pot with a bag of dried split peas, a chopped carrot, an onion, and water. Then it simmered low and slow for hours, during which the peas dissolved completely into a thick, green, porridge-like soup, and the bone gave up every last trace of its smoky, salty richness into the pot. By the end, the soup was so dense you could almost stand a spoon up in it, and the last shreds of meat that fell from the bone floated through it tender and sweet. Dried split peas cost about 9 cents a pound in the mid-1950s, and the bone was free, already paid for with the ham dinner, so the whole batch cost around 30 cents and fed a family for 2 full days. Best of all, it was forgiving. A cook could walk away and forget about it, and the soup would not scorch or spoil. It would just get thicker and better. It was standard cafeteria and hospital fare for exactly that reason: cheap and nearly impossible to ruin, and it warmed a person from the sternum outward. Number 70, vegetable beef soup. This was the great clean-out-the-crisper meal, the resourceful cook's weekly reckoning with everything that was starting to turn. The limp stalk of celery, the carrots gone soft, the half an onion wrapped in waxed paper, the potato with eyes starting to sprout, the wilting handful of green beans, all of it went into the pot. A little stew meat browned first for depth, then a can of tomatoes, water or broth, and everything else piled in on top and simmered for an hour or two until the kitchen windows fogged and the broth turned deep and savory and rich. Nothing was wasted, which was the entire point in a household that understood the value of every scrap, and the result was a hearty, warming supper that cost almost nothing because it was built entirely from odds and ends that might otherwise have been thrown out. The best part was that every batch came out a little different, depending on what happened to be languishing in the crisper that week, which meant no 2 pots ever tasted quite the same, and no 2 nights felt exactly alike. That small variety kept a monotonous, budget-bound diet from feeling like a punishment. A single big pot fed a family for days, and reheated, it only deepened in flavor. Number 69, beef barley soup. When a thin, watery beef broth needed to become a real, sticking to the ribs dinner, a handful of pearl barley was the cheap answer. Tossed into a pot of beef broth with whatever vegetables were on hand, onion and carrot and celery, and maybe a bit of tough beef, the barley swelled as it simmered, absorbing the liquid and thickening the whole soup into something dense, chewy, and deeply filling. A little barley went a remarkably long way, and it cost almost nothing, which made it a favorite trick for stretching a modest amount of meat and broth into a meal that could feed a large family. As it cooked, the barley turned tender and slightly plump, giving the soup a satisfying texture that plain broth could never have, and the whole thing sat heavy and warm in the stomach, exactly what a body wanted after a long day of cold, hard work. It was the kind of soup that improved overnight and reheated beautifully, so a single pot on Sunday carried a family well into the week. Frugal cooks across the country, especially those with Eastern European or Jewish roots, made a version of it because it was cheap, nourishing, and endlessly forgiving. It asked almost nothing and gave back a great deal, and now it turns up mostly on old diner menus. Number 68, chicken noodle soup. There is a reason this is the soup that every culture and every generation seems to know. It is the taste of being cared for. In a thrifty American kitchen, it started with a stewing hen, an old bird too tough and too far past, laying to be good for anything else, which was exactly why it was cheap. That hen simmered for hours with celery, carrot, and onion until the meat fell tender off the bone and the broth turned a deep, clear gold, rich with all the flavor cooked out of the bones. Then the meat was pulled and returned to the pot, and egg noodles were dropped in to cook until soft. It was the meal that appeared whenever someone was sick in bed, whenever the weather turned bitter and cold, and whenever a heart needed mending after a hard day or a hard loss. The broth was hydrating and gentle, the noodles and chicken were nourishing, and the whole bowl went down easy even when there was no appetite for anything else. Every mother and grandmother had her own version, passed down without a written recipe, and every child grew up understanding that a pot of this soup on the stove meant somebody loved them enough to make it. It cost little and gave much, which is the whole story of the food on this list. Number 67, cabbage soup. A single head of cabbage cost about a dime and could feed a family for 3 days, which is exactly why cabbage soup turned up on so many poor tables across the country. The cabbage was quartered or roughly chopped and dropped into a pot with an onion, a little tomato for brightness, whatever scrap of meat or bone or sausage happened to be around, and enough water to cover it all. Simmered long and slow, the cabbage lost its sharpness entirely and turned silky, soft, and faintly sweet, giving up its flavor into a broth that tasted far richer than its humble ingredients had any right to. Polish, German, Irish, and Eastern European families all made a version, each seasoned a little differently, because poverty crossed every kitchen the same way, and cabbage was cheap and plentiful in every one of them. It was the kind of meal that stretched endlessly, growing more flavorful as it sat, feeding a family through the coldest, leanest stretch of winter when little else was affordable. A pot of cabbage soup with a heel of bread was warmth and sustenance for pennies, the reliable fallback of immigrant and working-class households everywhere. It has largely vanished from American tables now, remembered chiefly as a fad diet rather than the honest, nourishing supper it once was. Number 66, lentil soup. Long before anyone called lentils a superfood, thrifty cooks knew them as the cheap, humble legume that made a fast, filling supper without any of the fuss that other dried beans demanded. A cup of dried lentils, 2 carrots, and an onion, simmered in water for about 30 minutes, broke down into a thick, earthy, satisfying stew that stuck to the ribs and kept a family full for hours. Unlike navy or kidney beans, lentils needed no overnight soaking and no long hours of cooking, which made them the perfect answer for a cook short on both time and money. The whole pot cost less than $1 to feed the entire table, even in the 1990s, and it delivered a remarkable amount of protein, fiber, iron, and folate, nutrients that kept families healthier than they ever realized. There is a story of a widow in Missouri who ate lentil stew 3 nights a week for 11 years after her husband died. And when her doctor marveled at her perfect iron levels, she simply said it was what her mother had taught her to make. She was not following any nutritional advice. She was following a memory and a budget, and the two together happened to keep her strong. Today, lentils are fashionable and pricey in some circles, but the plain, cheap soup our grandmothers made has faded. Number 65, chicken corn soup. In Pennsylvania Dutch country, this was the great communal dish, the church supper and firehouse fundraiser standard that could stretch a single hen across 100 hungry people. The cook simmered a chicken down into a rich golden broth, pulled and chopped the meat, and returned it to the pot along with plenty of corn, homemade egg noodles or little dough rivels, and, in the traditional version, chopped hard-boiled egg. The result was a thick, hearty, deeply comforting soup, bright yellow and loaded with substance that tasted like Sunday itself distilled into a bowl. It fed a fellowship hall or a fire company benefit for pennies a serving, which is why it became the go-to dish whenever a crowd needed feeding on a budget, and the whole community knew and loved it. Every family and every church had its own recipe, argued over and guarded, and the smell of it simmering meant a gathering was coming. It was economy and generosity in the same pot, the way one modest chicken could be made to feed a multitude if you knew how. Beyond the German farm country of Pennsylvania, it was little known, and even there the homemade version has grown scarce. But for generations, it was the taste of community, the soup that showed up whenever people came together to eat. Number 64, ham and navy beans. This was the everyday workhorse of the bean pot, the reliable weeknight supper that a ham bone and a bag of dried beans could conjure out of almost nothing. The cook soaked a bag of small white navy beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with a leftover ham bone, an onion, and a little pepper until the beans burst open and turned soft, and the broth thickened into a creamy, ivory white liquor, rich with smoky pork flavor. By the end, you could hardly tell where the broth ended and the beans began, and the last bits of meat clinging to the bone had fallen away tender into the pot. A 1-pound bag of navy beans cost about a dime, and the ham bone was free, already paid for with an earlier meal. So this pot fed a family for the better part of a week for pennies a bowl. Served with a wedge of cornbread for sopping up the broth, and maybe a slice of raw onion on the side, it was hearty, nourishing, and deeply satisfying. The kind of meal that got working families through hard winters and thin paychecks. This is the very soup the United States Senate cafeteria has served every single day since 1903, because it is cheap, filling, and beloved, and every senator who grew up poor recognized it as the taste of home. Number 63, Franks and beans. This was the cheerful, dead simple supper that children genuinely loved and mothers relied on because it cost almost nothing and never once failed. A can or two of pork and beans got dumped into a pot along with hot dogs sliced into coins, a spoon of prepared mustard, and a little brown sugar or molasses for sweetness, then heated through for 15 minutes until the whole thing was bubbling and the flavors had melded. That was it, and supper was on the table. The sweet, tangy sauce clung to the beans. The sliced Franks added just enough meat to make it feel substantial, and every kid at the table cleaned the plate without a word of complaint. A can of beans cost a dime, a package of hot dogs was cheap and kept well in the refrigerator, and together they made a filling meal for a whole family for well under $1. It required no skill, no watching, and no fresh ingredients at all, which made it the perfect fallback for a busy or broke weeknight or a quick supper before a scout meeting or a ball game. Served with brown bread or white bread and butter, it was humble, dependable comfort food, the kind of meal that shows up in the warm memories of anyone who grew up in a working-class American household. Number 62, Boston baked beans and brown bread. In New England, Saturday night meant baked beans, a tradition rooted in the old Puritan prohibition against cooking on the Sabbath. The beans were made ahead, so no work had to happen on Sunday. The cook soaked a pot of navy beans, then baked them low and slow for the better part of a day with a chunk of salt pork, molasses, brown sugar, mustard, and onion, until they turned deep, mahogany brown, sweet and tender, the sauce thick and sticky, and the pork melting into richness. Alongside came Boston brown bread, a dense, dark, slightly sweet bread, studded with raisins and steamed in a can rather than baked, its texture moist and hearty. Together, they made a cheap, filling, deeply satisfying supper that could feed a family for a couple of days and reheated beautifully. The whole meal was built on pantry staples, dried beans, molasses, a bit of cured pork, and it cost very little while delivering a great deal of warmth and sustenance through the cold northeastern winters. It was frugal by design and made ahead by necessity, which suited the thrifty Yankee household perfectly. Today, baked beans survive as a cookout side dish, but the Saturday night ritual of a pot of beans and a round of steamed brown bread as the whole supper has almost entirely disappeared. Number 61, succotash. This dish is older than the country itself, a gift from Native Americans who taught it to the early settlers, and its name comes from a Narragansett word for broken corn kernels. At its heart, it is beautifully simple. Lima beans and corn simmered together, traditionally with a piece of salt pork for depth, until the whole thing turns rich, creamy, and faintly smoky. The two vegetables together made something far greater than either alone. The sweet corn against the earthy beans, bound by the fat and salt of the pork into a dish substantial enough to serve as a main course in a poor household. Lima beans ran about 10 cents a pound, and corn came from the garden or cost a nickel a can, so a hearty pot of succotash cost almost nothing and fed a family well. In the South, it was served with cornbread as a full meal, and in New England, the same idea appeared with slightly different beans, because every region had its own version, and every version was cheap, nourishing, and filling. It carried families through the Depression and the lean years as honest, sustaining food, the kind that had kept people alive on this continent for centuries. Today it turns up mostly as a summer cookout side and nowhere near as often as it once did. Its long history and its role as a poor family's main dish nearly forgotten. Second pattern break. Here is something the food companies would rather you not sit with too long. The heart of the American family kitchen was never the meat. It was the pot of beans and the pot of soup, and both were built on ingredients no one can put a brand on. There is no advertising budget behind a bag of navy beans. There is no celebrity chef for a head of cabbage. The profit margin on a pound of split peas is pennies, which is exactly why you never saw a commercial for split pea soup. These were the meals that kept families independent and fed, and they were the meals nobody could get rich selling you. So they sold us frozen dinners at $4 a tray with less nutrition than a bowl of bean soup that cost 35 cents. The economics were never complicated. They were just quietly, deliberately cruel. Number 60, fried potatoes and onions. For millions of American families, a cast iron skillet full of fried potatoes was not a side dish. It was supper, plain and simple. The cook sliced raw potatoes thin, added a sliced onion, and fried them low and slow in bacon grease saved in a can on the back of the stove, letting them cook down patiently until the edges went crisp and golden brown, and the onions caramelized into sweet, soft ribbons woven through the whole pan. Maybe a slice of bread went alongside, and that was the entire meal. Potatoes cost almost nothing, around $3 for a 50-pound bag at a farm market. The onion came from the garden, and the bacon grease was free, saved from breakfast, so the whole supper cost mere pennies and filled every stomach at the table. As they cooked, the potatoes took on all the flavor of the fat, becoming something entirely different and far more delicious than a plain boiled potato. Children ate seconds, fathers asked about thirds, and for families who had it every Wednesday night, it was genuinely one of the best things they ate all week. Not a meal of defeat, but a real pleasure. The knack of frying potatoes right, low, and slow and patient was something every cook once knew, and it made a feast out of the humblest ingredient in the kitchen. Number 59, potato pancakes. Grated raw potato and onion, squeezed dry, bound with a little egg and flour and a pinch of salt, then fried in hot fat into thin, lacy, crisp cakes with soft, tender centers. This was a dish that Jewish, German, Polish, and Scandinavian families all made a version of, each with its own name and its own small variations. The trick was in the frying, getting the fat hot enough that the edges turned brown and shatteringly crisp, while the inside stayed creamy, and draining them well so they were not greasy. Served with applesauce, sour cream, or just salt, a few potatoes turned into a hot, deeply satisfying supper that used up whatever was in the potato bin and cost almost nothing. For immigrant families stretching a small food budget, potatoes were among the cheapest and most reliable staples, and turning them into crisp, golden pancakes made them feel like a treat rather than a hardship. In Jewish homes, they were a beloved part of Hanukkah, fried in oil to mark the holiday, but in many households they were simply an everyday way to make a filling meal from next to nothing. The smell of them frying, potato and onion and hot fat, is bound up in the childhood memories of countless families. They still appear at holidays, but the everyday weeknight version has grown much rarer. Number 58, corned beef hash. This was the meal that turned Sunday's leftovers into Monday's supper without spending another cent, a small triumph of thrift in the working-class kitchen. Leftover corned beef, already cooked and tender from a boiled dinner, got chopped fine and mixed with an equal amount of diced boiled potato and some chopped onion. Then, the whole mixture was pressed down firm into a hot, greased cast-iron skillet and left alone to cook undisturbed until a deep brown crust formed on the bottom, at which point it was turned and crisped on the other side. A fried egg cranked over the top, its yolk breaking golden into the salty, crusty hash, made it a proper dinner rather than just a use for leftovers. Nothing was wasted, which was the entire point in a household that understood the value of every scrap of meat, and the transformation from plain leftovers into something crisp and savory and new felt almost like getting a second meal for free. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly satisfying, the kind of dish that tasted even better than the roast it came from. Diners made it famous, but it was born at home, in the frugal habit of never letting good food go to waste, and it remains one of the great humble pleasures of the American table. Number 57, red flannel hash. This was the cheerful New England cousin of corned beef hash, distinguished by one clever addition, a chopped, cooked beet, which stained the entire skillet a deep, festive, rosy pink. Made from the scraps of a boiled dinner, the leftover corned beef, potatoes, and now beets all chopped together and fried down into a crusty hash. It took the humblest of leftovers and turned them into something that looked bright and celebratory on a gray winter morning. The beet added not just its startling color, but a faint, earthy sweetness that played against the salt of the corned beef, and the whole thing crisped up in the pan just like ordinary hash, with a browned crust and a fried egg on top. Farm families across New England ate it for supper or breakfast and genuinely considered it a treat, a way of dressing up the tail end of the week's meals into something with a little flair. The name came from its cheerful color, the pink of red flannel underwear hung on the line, and it spoke to a certain Yankee wit about making the most of what you had. Like so many leftover dishes, it depended on a tradition of cooking large and wasting nothing, and as that tradition faded, red flannel hash slipped quietly out of the American kitchen, remembered now only in old regional cookbooks. Number 56, American chop suey. Despite the name, this dish had absolutely nothing to do with China. It was a New England invention through and through, a one-pot supper of elbow macaroni, ground beef, onion, and a can of tomatoes all cooked together into a hearty, saucy, satisfying meal. The cook browned the beef with the onion, stirred in the macaroni and the tomatoes, and enough liquid to cook the pasta, and let it simmer until the noodles were tender and had soaked up the tomato and drippings. Cheap, fast, and filling, it fed a crowd for very little money, which is exactly why it became a fixture in school cafeterias, church basement suppers, and family kitchens all across New England. A pound of ground beef stretched a long way when bulked out with a whole box of macaroni and a can of tomatoes, and the leftovers reheated even better the second day, once the noodles had fully absorbed the sauce. It was the kind of dish a mother could throw together on a busy weeknight with pantry staples and a little ground beef, and every child in the region grew up eating it. The borrowed name was just a bit of mid-century whimsy, the way exotic-sounding titles got slapped onto thoroughly American dishes. It remains a beloved comfort food in New England, though far less common than it once was. Number 55, American goulash. This was the same basic idea as American chop suey, dressed up in a borrowed Hungarian name it did not deserve, and it kept millions of American families fed without complaint through the 1960s and 70s. Browned ground beef, elbow macaroni, chopped onion and tomato sauce or crushed tomatoes all simmered together in one pot until the noodles drank up the sauce and turned tender, and the whole thing came together into a thick, savory, comforting mass. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to the real Hungarian goulash, that paprika-rich beef stew, but the name gave a plain, cheap supper a little touch of the exotic, and nobody minded the mismatch. What mattered was that it was easy, filling, and inexpensive, built from a pound of ground beef and a box of macaroni and a can of tomatoes, and that it fed a big family with leftovers to spare. Every region and every family had its own slight variation, some with a little green pepper, some with a shake of Worcestershire or a handful of cheese, but the bones of it were always the same. It was the ultimate weeknight stretch meal, the kind of thing a mother could make on autopilot when money was tight and mouths were many. Generations of American children grew up on it, and it lingers in the memory as pure, humble comfort, though the name still confuses anyone who knows the original. Number 54, Johnny Marzetti. This baked casserole was a Midwest institution named for a restaurant run by the Marzetti family in Columbus, Ohio in the early 20th century, and it spread from there into school cafeterias, church suppers, and family kitchens across the region. At its heart, it was ground beef, egg noodles, tomato sauce, and cheese, layered or mixed together in a big dish and baked until bubbling and golden, and the cheese on top browned and crisped at the edges. Some versions added mushrooms, green pepper, or onion, and every cook and every institution had its own particular take. But the essential comfort of it never changed. It was cheap to make in enormous quantities, which made it the perfect dish for feeding a crowd, and it fed church potlucks, school lunch lines, and big hungry families for pennies a plate. A cook could make a big pan on Sunday, and it would carry the family clear through to Wednesday, tasting better each day as the flavors settled. It was hearty, familiar, and deeply satisfying, the kind of casserole that defined a whole region's idea of a good, affordable supper. Outside the Midwest, it was little known, but there it was beloved, a name that instantly conjured the smell of a warm kitchen and a full table. Today it has faded even in its home territory, remembered mostly by those who grew up on it. Number 53, Spanish rice. This colorful skillet dish was a clever way to stretch a small amount of ground beef across a whole pan and put something bright and appealing on the table for very little money. The cook browned rice in a skillet with a little fat until it turned golden and nutty, added chopped onion and green pepper, then stirred in tomatoes or tomato sauce, and a modest amount of browned ground beef, along with a little seasoning. It all simmered together until the rice absorbed the liquid and turned tender, and the whole thing took on a warm red color. The rice was the real bulk of it, cheap and filling, and the small handful of beef and the tomato and vegetables gave it flavor, and made it feel like a proper meal rather than just a bowl of rice. It cost very little, fed a family generously, and brought welcome color and a hint of spice to an otherwise drab, budget-bound weeknight table. Nearly every American cookbook from the 1950s had a version of it, and it turned up regularly in home kitchens and school cafeterias alike, a reliable way to make a small amount of meat go a long way. Despite the name, it was thoroughly Americanized, bearing only a loose relationship to any actual Spanish or Mexican dish, and today, crowded out by boxed mixes and other options, hardly anyone makes it from scratch anymore. Number 52, macaroni and tomatoes. This was not macaroni and cheese, and it was not pasta with marinara sauce. It was something older, plainer, and more honest than either of those things, a dish born of pure Southern thrift. The cook boiled a box of elbow macaroni, drained it and tossed it right back into the pot with a can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand, a good amount of salt and pepper, and a knob of bacon grease. That was the entire recipe. The tomatoes coated the macaroni in a bright, acidic, savory sauce that tasted nothing like anything from a restaurant or a jar, something plainer and more filling and more comforting, and the bacon grease gave it a smoky depth that tied it all together. A can of tomatoes cost about 12 cents in the 1950s, and a box of macaroni was a dime, so this dish fed 4 people with enough left over for the next day's lunch for almost nothing. Every Southern grandmother made it, and it appeared in church cookbooks from Georgia to Mississippi listed without any ingredients at all, because everyone already knew exactly how to make it. Today's home cooks have almost entirely replaced it with jarred pasta sauce and never looked back. And that quiet substitution is a loss that nobody really notices, one small piece of everyday Southern cooking slipping out of living memory. Number 51, baked macaroni and cheese. Forget the box with the neon powder. The real thing was a labor of quiet love. A mother boiled a pot of elbows, then layered them in a buttered dish with handfuls of sharp cheddar, sometimes a little grated onion, and poured over a custard of eggs, milk, and a pinch of dry mustard. Some cooks made a proper cheese sauce first, a roux of butter and flour loosened with milk and melted cheese, then folded the noodles in and crowned the whole thing with buttered breadcrumbs. Into the oven it went until the top browned and crackled and the edges bubbled up crisp and golden. A half-pound of cheese, about 30 cents in the 1950s, stretched to feed a whole table because the milk and eggs did the rest of the work. It was Depression thrift and Sunday dinner comfort at the very same time. It carried families through Lent, through funerals, through cold afternoons when the house smelled like nothing else on earth. Children never left a bite, and they fought over the browned corners. Today we tear open a box and boil for 7 minutes and call it the same thing. It is not the same thing. Number 50, haluski. In the mill towns and factory neighborhoods of the industrial North, this was the dish that turned a head of cabbage and a bag of noodles into a full, satisfying supper for a whole hungry family. The cook melted a generous amount of butter in a big skillet, then added sliced onion and coarsely chopped cabbage and cooked it low and slow, patiently, until the cabbage collapsed and went soft and sweet and the edges caramelized golden brown. Boiled egg noodles got tossed right into the pan and fried together with the cabbage until everything was buttery and tangled and hot. That was the whole thing, and it needed nothing else. Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, and Ukrainian families all made their own version, seasoned simply with salt and plenty of black pepper, because in kitchens where money was tight and mouths were many, cabbage and noodles were among the cheapest things a cook could buy. A single head of cabbage cost a dime, and a bag of egg noodles not much more, and together they fed a mill family for the better part of a week. It was humble beyond humble, but the buttery sweetness of the cabbage against the tender noodles made it genuine comfort food, the taste of a working-class childhood. Number 49, pierogi. These little half-moon dough pockets were the pride of Polish, Slovak, and Ukrainian kitchens across the steel and coal country of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and making them was never a one-person job. It was a whole family affair around the kitchen table, everyone rolling and cutting the dough, spooning in the filling and crimping the edges shut, an assembly line built on tradition and gossip and shared work. The classic filling was mashed potato blended with cheese, though sauerkraut, farmer's cheese, and even fruit versions all had their place. The pockets were boiled until they floated, then finished in a hot skillet with butter and onions until the outsides browned and blistered and the onions went sweet and soft. A single batch, made by many hands, fed everyone at the table twice over, and the extras froze well for later, which made the day of labor worth it. In the steel towns, Friday, the traditional meatless day for Catholic families, meant pierogi and nothing else, a supper both economical and deeply satisfying. They were cheap, filling, and made almost entirely from potatoes, flour, and a little cheese, and they carried the flavor of the old country into American kitchens. Today, they come frozen in a box, but the homemade tradition and the family gathered to make them has largely faded. Number 48, kielbasa and sauerkraut. This was the hearty, no-fuss supper of Eastern European immigrant kitchens all across America, a dish built for the cold and the tired. A ring of smoked kielbasa sausage got nestled down into a pot of sauerkraut, sometimes with a little chopped onion, a diced apple, or a splash of beer, and simmered low until the sharp tang of the kraut mellowed and softened, and the whole kitchen filled with the smell of smoke and sausage and cabbage. The kielbasa gave up its garlicky, smoky richness into the kraut, and the kraut cut the fattiness of the sausage, the two balancing each other perfectly. A single ring of kielbasa fed a family, kept for weeks in the refrigerator without spoiling, and needed nothing but a fork and maybe some boiled potatoes or a heel of rye bread alongside. It required almost no skill and almost no work, just the patience to let it simmer, which made it a reliable weeknight standby for Polish, German, Slovak, and Ukrainian households through the lean years and beyond. Cheap, filling, and deeply flavorful, it crossed every Eastern European kitchen in the country and became a beloved comfort food. It still turns up around the holidays in families of that heritage, but as an everyday supper, it has grown rare. Number 47, stuffed cabbage rolls. Known by a dozen names across a dozen kitchens, halupki, golubki, holishkis, this was the labor of love supper that a Polish, Ukrainian, or Hungarian mother spent a whole afternoon making, and it fed the family for days. First, the cabbage leaves were softened, blanched in boiling water until they turned pliable enough to roll without tearing. Then each leaf was wrapped snugly around a filling of ground meat, usually beef or pork or a mix, blended with cooked rice and onion and seasoning. The little bundles were packed tight into a pan, covered with a tomato sauce, and baked slow and low for hours until the cabbage went meltingly tender and the filling cooked through and the whole thing turned rich and savory. The rice was the clever thrift at the heart of it, doubling the filling for almost nothing so that a modest amount of meat stretched across a large panful, and the cabbage leaf itself became the wrapper, the bowl, and part of the meal all at once. It was economical, nourishing, and deeply satisfying, the kind of dish that improved as it sat and reheated beautifully. Every family guarded its own recipe, argued over sweet versus savory sauce, and served it at holidays and on ordinary weeknights alike. Today it survives mostly at church festivals and holiday tables. Number 46, stuffed green peppers. This was the dish that made 1 pound of ground beef feed a family of 6 without a single person feeling shortchanged. A small miracle of mid-century thrift. Bell peppers were halved or hollowed out, the tops cut off, and the seeds and ribs scraped clean, leaving a sturdy little cup ready to be filled. The stuffing was browned ground beef, mixed with cooked rice, chopped onion, and tomato, seasoned simply, packed into the peppers, and set upright in a baking dish with a little tomato juice or sauce in the bottom to steam them soft as they baked. Out of the oven they came, the peppers tender and slightly sweet, the filling savory and substantial, each pepper its own complete individual serving. The rice was the stretch, bulking up the meat so a little went a long way, and the pepper itself became the edible bowl, which meant less to wash and more to eat. They cost almost nothing. Bell peppers ran a nickel apiece at a roadside stand, and ground beef was cheap. Yet they looked like real effort and felt like genuine abundance on the table, sitting there colorful and plump. They were a weeknight fixture across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and they looked far more impressive than their humble cost suggested. Neither the effort nor the expense was as great as it seemed. Number 45, porcupine meatballs. Children loved the name, and mothers loved the economy, which made this one of the great thrifty suppers of the mid-century American kitchen. The trick that gave the dish its name was mixing raw, uncooked rice directly into the ground beef, along with onion and seasoning before shaping the mixture into meatballs. As the meatballs simmered in a pot of tomato sauce, the rice inside them swelled and cooked, and the grains pushed out through the surface of the meat, sticking out like little quills, exactly like the spines of a porcupine. The genius of it was that the rice tripled the volume of the meat, so a single pound of ground beef became enough meatballs to feed a whole hungry table, and the rice also thickened and enriched the tomato sauce as it cooked. Served with the sauce spooned over the top, maybe alongside some bread or mashed potatoes, it was a hearty, satisfying, and endlessly economical supper. The long, slow simmer did all the work, tenderizing the meat and cooking the rice through, so the cook could walk away and let it go. It fed big families through the Depression and the lean post-war years, and stayed in the weeknight rotation for decades, a clever way to make a little meat feed a lot of people. The playful name kept the children happy, and the low cost kept the household afloat. Number 44, Swedish meatballs. Across the Scandinavian settlements of Minnesota, the Dakotas, and the upper Midwest, these tender little meatballs in creamy gravy were the taste of home and heritage, made for every holiday and half the ordinary Tuesdays in between. The meatballs were small and delicate. The ground meat, often a mix of beef and pork, blended with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, grated onion, and warm spices like allspice and nutmeg, which gave them their distinctive gentle flavor. The soaked bread was the thrift and the tenderness both, stretching the meat further while keeping the meatballs soft and moist. Browned in a skillet, they were then simmered in a rich, silky cream gravy made from the pan drippings and served over egg noodles or mashed potatoes, often with a spoonful of tart lingonberry preserves on the side. That cream sauce was the magic, turning cheap ground meat into something that tasted rich and special and festive, a dish worthy of a holiday table yet affordable enough for a weeknight. Scandinavian grandmothers made them by the hundreds for Christmas smorgasbords and church suppers, and every family had its own carefully guarded seasoning. They were comfort and celebration in the same bite, humble ingredients elevated by technique and tradition. Today, the frozen and cafeteria versions are everywhere, but the real homemade article, tender and fragrant with spice, has grown far less common. Number 43, Sloppy Joes. This was the very definition of a cheap, happy weeknight family dinner, the meal that made children come running and mothers breathe easy. A pound of ground beef got browned in a skillet with chopped onion, then simmered in a sweet and tangy tomato sauce, ketchup and tomato sauce sharpened with a little Worcestershire, mustard, brown sugar, and vinegar until it turned thick and glossy and rich. That saucy meat got spooned generously onto a soft hamburger bun where it inevitably dripped and slid and made a glorious mess, which is exactly how it earned its name. 1 pound of ground beef fed the whole table because the sauce stretched it further and bulked it up. So a modest amount of meat became a satisfying supper for a crowd for well under $1. Children genuinely thought it was a treat, a fun, messy, delicious dinner they got to eat with their hands, and mothers loved that it was fast, cheap, and never failed to disappear off the plate. It came together in 20 minutes from pantry staples and a little ground beef, and it fit perfectly into the busy weeknight rhythm of the American family. It remains a nostalgic favorite, though the from-scratch version has largely given way to the can, and few remember it as the clever thrift meal it always was. Number 42, Frito Pie. This was the 5-minute supper that made kids come running, a southwestern invention of pure, cheerful economy. At its simplest, it was a handful of corn chips in a bowl with a ladle of hot chili spooned over the top, finished with a shower of grated cheese and chopped raw onion. In its most beloved form, a small bag of corn chips was split open right down the side, and the chili and toppings piled directly into the bag, eaten with a fork or a spoon straight from the foil, no dish to wash at all. The salty crunch of the corn chips against the warm, spicy chili and the melting cheese made something greater than the sum of its cheap parts, and children devoured it. It cost next to nothing, especially when made with a batch of homemade chili stretching a small amount of meat, and it came together in the time it took to open a bag and heat the chili. Church potlucks, ball games, and school cafeterias across Texas and the Southwest ran on it, and it became a regional institution beloved by generations. It was fun, fast, filling, and forgiving, the kind of no-fuss meal a busy or broke family could always fall back on. It still appears at concession stands and fairs, but as a home supper it has faded. Number 41, Tamale Pie. This dish gave a Southwestern family the deep, satisfying taste of tamales without the entire day of labor that real tamales demanded, which made it a brilliant weeknight shortcut. Instead of wrapping and steaming dozens of individual corn husks, the cook made a layer of seasoned ground beef, simmered with tomato, onion, chili powder, and sometimes corn or olives, and spread it in a baking dish. Over the top went a layer of cornmeal batter, essentially a soft cornbread or a thick mesa, which baked up into a golden, tender crust that captured the flavor and spirit of the tamale in a fraction of the time. Baked until the top set firm and golden and the filling bubbled beneath, it was cut into hearty squares and served warm. A little meat went a long way, bulked out by the generous cornmeal topping, so it fed a whole family cheaply. And, like so many of these dishes, the leftovers were even better the next day once the flavors had settled and mingled. It appeared in cookbooks and on weeknight tables across the Southwest and far beyond, a reliable, economical way to bring a little south of the border warmth to the family supper without the fuss. It was thrift and flavor in equal measure, and today, crowded out by convenience foods, it has mostly slipped from the rotation. Third, pattern break. Here is what almost no one says out loud about the American table. Nearly every dish we now think of as classic American home cooking walked in through somebody's immigrant grandmother. The goulash came from Hungary, the pierogi from Poland, the stuffed cabbage from Ukraine, the succotash from Native Americans, the red beans from the Caribbean by way of New Orleans. Poor families borrowed freely across every fence line because hunger does not care where your people came from. A German recipe got made with whatever was cheap that week, a Mexican one got adapted for a Midwest pantry, and within a generation nobody remembered it had ever been foreign at all. That was the real melting pot, and it happened in cast iron skillets, not in speeches. The forgetting was the loss. When we traded these dishes for the freezer aisle, we did not just lose recipes, we lost the map of where we all came from. Number 40, chili con carne with beans. This was the ultimate batch meal, the pot that a cook made on Sunday and the family ate all week, and it only got better as it went. Ground beef browned in a pot, then a can of kidney beans, a can of tomatoes, a good measure of chili powder, some cumin and salt, all simmered together for half an hour or more until it thickened into a rich, spiced, satisfying pot of chili. The beauty of it was the way it stretched and lasted. The beans made it filling and bulked out the meat. The tomatoes gave it brightness and body, and a single pot fed a family for 3 days, tasting deeper and better on the second day than the first once the flavors had married. For a household cooking on a budget, it was the perfect economy. Cheap ingredients transformed by time into something hearty and warming that asked nothing more than the occasional stir. Church food banks and charity pantries knew the recipe by heart and packed the exact ingredients together in bags because they understood precisely who would make it and exactly how far it would stretch across a hungry family. It was not the fussy competition chili of brisket and dried peppers, but the honest poor man's version, the kind that kept people fed through hard winters and thin paychecks. It remains a beloved American staple, though the everyday from-scratch pot has grown less common. Number 39, chili mac. When a pot of chili had to stretch even further to feed more mouths than it was ever meant to, elbow macaroni went right into the pot, and a supper for 4 became a supper for 8. The cooked pasta soaked up the spiced tomato and bean sauce, doubling the volume of the whole dish while adding almost no cost, and the starch from the macaroni thickened everything into a hearty, clingy, satisfying mass. It was the ultimate weeknight stretch, cheap and hot and endlessly forgiving. The kind of meal a mother made when the paycheck was thin and the table was full. The combination of chili and pasta was pure American thrift, marrying 2 of the most economical things in the kitchen into one filling bowl that children happily devoured. It cooked in the same pot as the chili, so there was little extra work and only one thing to wash, and the leftovers reheated just as well as they always did. Whether made from a fresh pot of chili or from yesterday's leftovers with noodles stirred in, it turned a limited amount of food into a generous meal, which was the whole art of feeding a family on very little. Cincinnati made a famous version of its own, and cafeterias everywhere served it, but the humble home version, born of necessity, has quietly faded. Number 38, one-pot beef and macaroni. This was the busy, broke weeknight distilled to its most efficient form. 1 pound of ground beef, 1 box of elbow macaroni, 1 can of tomato sauce, and enough water to cook the noodles, all in a single pot. The cook browned the beef and drained the fat, then added the raw macaroni, the tomato sauce, and the water, and let the whole thing simmer until the pasta cooked tender right there in the pot, absorbing the tomato and the meat drippings as it went. 15 minutes from start to finish, and just 1 pan to wash afterward, which mattered enormously to a tired mother at the end of a long day. It tasted like a stripped-down, simplified version of every beefy casserole a family had ever eaten, hearty and comforting and familiar, and it reheated even better the next day once the noodles had fully soaked up the sauce. There was no measuring, no fuss, no separate pots for the pasta and the sauce, just the cheapest ingredients in the kitchen turned into a filling supper for a whole family for well under $1. It fed children who never knew or cared how little it cost, and it kept countless households going through tight times. Known by a dozen casual names in a dozen kitchens, it was the reliable fallback, and today the boxed helper mixes have largely replaced it. Number 37, beef and noodles. In the rural Midwest, this was pure comfort and pure economy on the same plate, and nobody apologized for the fact that it was starch piled on starch. The cook took cheap stew beef, or a tough cut, and simmered it low and slow for hours until it fell apart, tender, and the broth turned deep and rich. Then, wide egg noodles went right into that same flavorful broth to cook, drinking up all the beefy goodness, and the whole thing, meat and noodles and gravy together, got ladled generously over a mound of mashed potatoes. Yes, noodles over potatoes, and it was glorious, a double dose of soft, warm, filling starch bound together by rich brown gravy and shreds of tender beef. It was the kind of meal that stuck to the ribs and warmed a person through on a cold prairie night, and it stretched a small, cheap piece of meat into a supper that fed a whole farm family with plenty to go around. The long simmer was the secret, transforming the toughest, cheapest cut into something meltingly tender for almost nothing but time and patience. It appeared on Midwestern tables for generations, a beloved regional comfort food that made no apologies for its humble, doubled-up starchiness. It endures at church suppers and in old family kitchens, but as everyday fare, it has grown scarce. Number 36, beef stroganoff. This was the dish that sounded Russian and expensive and looked like something off a fancy restaurant menu, yet cost almost nothing to make, which is exactly why the thrifty mid-century cook adored it. Strips of cheap round steak, or sometimes even ground beef, got browned in a skillet. Then a can of cream of mushroom soup went in along with a spoonful of sour cream and maybe some sautéed onion and mushroom, and the whole thing simmered into a rich, creamy, savory sauce. Served over egg noodles, it looked and tasted like a special occasion dinner, elegant and indulgent, the kind of meal a hostess might serve to impress company. But the secret was that the can of soup did all the work, providing the creamy base and the mushroom flavor without any skill or expense, so a woman could set down an impressive-seeming dish that had, in truth, come together out of a pantry can and a cheap cut of meat in half an hour. The tangy sour cream and the creamy sauce transformed the humble beef into something that felt luxurious, and the noodles stretched it to feed the whole family. It ruled dinner parties and weeknight tables alike throughout the 1950s and the 60s, a masterpiece of thrift disguised as sophistication. The real thing still exists, but the beloved soup can version has faded from memory. Number 35, Swiss steak. This dish was proof that patience and technique could do what money could not, turning a tough, cheap cut of beef into something that ate like a Sunday roast. The cook took a slab of round steak, one of the least expensive and toughest cuts in the case, and pounded it thin with a mallet or the edge of a plate, working flour into it as she went, which both tenderized the meat and helped it brown. Then it was seared in a hot skillet and braised low and slow for hours in a sauce of tomatoes, onions, and sometimes celery and pepper until the connective tissue broke down completely and the once shoe leather beef turned fork tender and rich. The long, gentle cooking was the whole secret, transforming a cut that would have been inedibly tough if simply fried into something meltingly soft, smothered in a savory tomato gravy. Served over mashed potatoes, rice, or noodles to catch the sauce, it made a hearty, satisfying supper for a fraction of the price of a proper steak, feeding a whole family on the cheapest beef available. Despite the name, it had nothing to do with Switzerland, referring instead to the process of Swissing or pounding and rolling the meat. It was a weeknight and Sunday standby for generations of frugal families, and today it survives mostly on old diner menus and in the memories of those who grew up on it. Number 34, round steak and gravy. When even Swiss steak felt like too much fuss, a family could still turn the cheapest cut in the butcher's case into a filling supper with nothing more than flour, an onion, and thyme. A slab of round steak, tough and inexpensive, got dredged in seasoned flour and browned hard in a skillet to build flavor. Then onions and water or broth went in, and the whole thing was covered and simmered low and slow until the meat finally gave in and turned tender and the drippings thickened into a rich brown onion gravy. Served over rice, mashed potatoes, or bread, the gravy was really the star of the meal, savory and abundant. And the little bit of beef in it was almost a bonus. The meat itself stretched thin, so the flavorful gravy could do the work of feeding everyone. It cost almost nothing, just a cheap cut of meat and a few pantry staples, yet it filled the whole family and sent them away satisfied. This was survival cooking at its most resourceful, making a modest piece of tough beef feed a crowd by turning it into gravy that stretched across every plate. It appeared on the tables of farm families and city families alike, the humble fallback when a proper roast was out of reach. And today it has largely disappeared, replaced by quicker and costlier cuts. Number 33, chicken fried steak. Born on the Texas plains from the collision of tough Texas beef and the German and Austrian breading traditions the settlers brought with them, this dish turned the cheapest steak, in the case, into a plate that felt like a genuine splurge. A cube steak, already run through the tenderizing machine and about as cheap as beef came, got pounded even thinner, then dredged in seasoned flour and egg and fried crisp in hot fat, just like a piece of fried chicken, which is exactly where the name came from. Out of the skillet, it came golden and crackling on the outside, the crust shattering to reveal tender beef within. Then, in the drippings left in the pan, the cook made a thick, peppery milk gravy, a simple cream gravy that got poured generously over the top. That gravy was the great stretcher, extending a single modest piece of cheap steak into a hearty meal that fed the whole family when served over mashed potatoes with a side of vegetables. It was hearty, indulgent, and deeply satisfying, the kind of plate that felt like a treat despite costing almost nothing, and it became a defining dish of Texas and Southern cooking. It still holds a place of honor on diner menus across the region, but the everyday homemade version, made with care in a cast iron skillet, has grown rarer. Number 32, Salisbury steak. This was a hamburger dressed up to look and feel like a proper steak, a bit of clever mid-century thrift that let a family eat steak for the price of ground beef. The cook mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs, egg, onion, and seasoning, stretching the meat with the filler, then shaped the mixture into oval patties meant to resemble steaks. Browned in a skillet and then simmered in a rich brown onion gravy, often thickened with a little flour and darkened with a splash of Worcestershire, the patties turned tender and savory, and the gravy tied the whole dish together. Served over mashed potatoes or noodles, it was hearty and comforting and looked far more substantial than the cheap ground beef it was made from. The breadcrumbs did double duty, stretching the meat so it fed more mouths for less money while also keeping the patties moist. Named for a 19th century doctor who championed a meat-heavy diet, it became a fixture of the American table, made famous by frozen TV dinners and diner blue plate specials alike, the little oval patty swimming in brown gravy in its compartmented tray. It was the everyman's steak, dignity, and heartiness conjured out of the humblest beef. Today it lives mostly in the memory of the TV dinner era, though the homemade version remains a genuine comfort. Number 31, hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. Farmers had a name for this one, poor man's steak, though the mothers who made it just called it supper, and the children who ate it called it delicious. It was one of the most economical hot meals a family could put on the table, feeding 6 people for under $1. Ground beef browned in a cast iron skillet with diced onion, then a spoonful of flour stirred in to coat the meat, and milk poured over slowly until the whole thing bubbled up into a thick, savory white gravy shot through with browned beef. That gravy got ladled over a mountain of mashed potatoes, and the two melted together so that every single forkful carried both the rich meat gravy and the soft, buttery potato. Ground beef cost around 43 cents a pound in the mid-1950s, and a 5-pound bag of potatoes was under 30 cents. So this filling, satisfying meal came together for almost nothing and stretched a small amount of meat across a whole hungry family. It was heavy and comforting in the way that only food made of starch and fat can be, the kind of supper that sent everyone away full. It appeared on tables from Montana ranch kitchens to Detroit tenement apartments, universal in its thrift and its comfort. It had no elegant name and needed none, and today it has all but vanished. Number 30, meatballs and brown gravy. This was another masterful stretch of a single pound of ground beef, turning it into a groaning platter that fed the whole family, and the secret was the bread. Before shaping the meatballs, the cook tore slices of bread and soaked them in milk until they turned to mush, then mixed that soggy paste thoroughly into the ground beef along with egg and onion and seasoning. That soaked bread was everything. It doubled the volume of the meat, so a little went a long way, and the starch held moisture throughout, keeping the meatballs tender and juicy instead of dense and dry. Browned in a skillet, the meatballs were then simmered in a rich brown gravy made from the drippings, thickened with flour and darkened with a little broth, and served over egg noodles or mashed potatoes to catch every drop. The gravy stretched the meal even further, savory and abundant, coating the soft starch beneath. A single pound of beef, bulked out with bread and cloaked in gravy, became enough to feed a large family generously and send everyone away satisfied. This was Depression-born wisdom carried forward for decades, the art of making one thing feed many, and professional chefs now call the soaked bread trick a panade and treat it as a fancy technique. Our grandmothers just called it making supper stretch, and today the dish has quietly faded. Number 29, liver and onions. Here is a meal that food companies would rather you forget, because it was cheap, it was nutritious, and nobody could really profit from it. Beef liver was one of the most nutrient-dense foods an American family could put on the table, packed with iron, vitamin B12, folate, and protein, and it cost about 20 cents a pound because butchers had more of it than they knew what to do with. The cook sliced it thin, dredged it in seasoned flour, and laid it in a hot skillet, cooking it fast, just 2 minutes aside, because any longer turned it tough and bitter, which is precisely why a generation grew up hating it. Done right, though, it was mild and rich, the outside golden and slightly crisp, the inside still faintly pink and tender. A second pan held onions cooked down slow until they caramelized sweet and soft, and they went piled over the top, their sweetness cutting the richness of the liver. Served with mashed potatoes and a vegetable, it made a complete, deeply nourishing meal for around 30 cents. We stopped cooking it the moment we could afford to choose something else, associating it with hard times and the tough, overcooked versions of childhood. But the nutrition never went anywhere. Only the knowledge of how to cook it right disappeared. Number 28, chicken livers and rice. These were the cheapest scraps at the butcher counter, the parts nobody else wanted, which is exactly what made them a resourceful cook's quiet secret. A pound of chicken livers cost mere pennies, and in the right hands they became a rich, savory, deeply satisfying supper. The cook dredged the livers in seasoned flour and fried them fast in a hot skillet until the outsides turned crisp and golden, while the insides stayed tender and creamy, taking care not to overcook them into rubber. Then, in the drippings left in the pan, she made a quick gravy, scraping up the browned bits and thickening it with a little flour and broth, and served the whole thing spooned over a bed of white rice. The rice soaked up the savory gravy and stretched the meal to feed a family, while the livers themselves delivered an outsized dose of iron and protein for almost no money at all. It was the kind of dish that a thrifty cook made without fanfare, turning an overlooked, throwaway ingredient into something genuinely delicious for the price of an afterthought. Southern and immigrant kitchens especially prized it, and it fed families well through lean times. Today, with organ meats out of fashion and chicken livers overlooked entirely, most Americans have never tasted it, and one of the great cheap suppers has faded from the table. Number 27, beef heart stew. A whole beef heart was one of the very cheapest cuts at the counter, an organ most modern shoppers wouldn't dream of buying, and that was exactly why the resourceful farm cook prized it. Cut into chunks and simmered for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth, the heart, which is really just a hard-working muscle, turned meltingly tender and took on a deep, beefy flavor that ate like the finest pot roast at a tiny fraction of the price. The long, slow cooking was essential, breaking down the dense muscle into something soft and rich, and the vegetables and broth around it made a hearty, complete stew that fed a whole family for almost nothing. Farm families, who often slaughtered their own animals, understood that wasting an organ as substantial and nourishing as the heart was simply not done, and they knew that, treated right, it was as good as any expensive cut on the animal. Lean and packed with protein and iron, it delivered real nutrition alongside real economy, filling stomachs through hard winters and lean years. It was honest, humble food that asked only for patience and returned a great deal. As home butchering faded and organ meats fell out of favor, the beef heart disappeared from the family table, and today most Americans have never eaten one, unaware that it was once a beloved and thrifty Sunday quality supper. Number 26, beef tongue. To squeamish modern eyes, it looks strange and off-putting, but beef tongue was, in truth, one of the tenderest and most flavorful cuts on the entire animal, and it cost almost nothing precisely because nobody else wanted it. The cook simmered the whole tongue for hours in seasoned water with onion and spices until it was fully tender, at which point the tough outer skin peeled away easily to reveal the rich, soft meat beneath. That meat sliced beautifully, fine-grained and remarkably tender, and it could be served warm with a gravy or a horseradish sauce, or chilled and sliced thin for sandwiches. Rich, beefy, and buttery in texture, it delighted anyone willing to get past the appearance, and it fed a family generously for the price of a cut most butchers were glad to sell cheap. Jewish, German, Mexican, and rural farm kitchens all treasured it, each with their own way of preparing it, whether pickled, in tacos de lengua, or as cold cuts, and it turned up on tables high and low for generations. It was economical, nourishing, and genuinely delicious, a cut prized by those in the know. But as tastes narrowed and organ and offal cuts fell out of fashion in the American mainstream, the tongue vanished from the ordinary family table, and today most people would never think to cook one. Number 25, brains and eggs. This was a prized, protein-rich breakfast for supper in farm and immigrant kitchens across the country, born of the same waste-nothing ethic that governed every corner of the poor household. When a hog or a calf was butchered, the brains were far too valuable to throw away, so they were carefully soaked in salted water to firm them and clean them, then gently scrambled together with beaten eggs over low heat until the whole thing set into something soft, creamy, and delicately rich. The mild flavor took well to salt and pepper, and the texture was custard-like, almost luxurious, folded through the eggs. Served with biscuits or toast, it made a hearty, nourishing meal that used up a part of the animal that would otherwise have gone to waste. And it delivered a concentrated dose of nutrition for those doing hard, physical labor. It was ordinary once, a common dish in the rural South, in German and Eastern European households, and anywhere families raised and butchered their own animals. Nobody thought it strange. It was simply supper, cheap and filling and good. But changes in meat processing and mounting food safety concerns quietly erased it from American kitchens over the decades, and today most Americans have never heard of it, let alone tasted it, one more casualty of a time when nothing edible was ever wasted. Number 24, neck bones and rice. Smoked pork neck bones were among the very cheapest things at the butcher counter, a scrap the butcher practically gave away, and in southern black kitchens, they became the foundation of a deeply flavorful, soul-warming supper. The cook simmered the neck bones low and slow for hours, with onion and seasoning, until the little bits of meat clinging to them turned fall-apart tender, and the bones gave up all their smoky richness into the pot, creating a savory, deeply satisfying broth. The meat was picked from the bones, and the whole thing, meat and rich pot liquor together, got served over a bed of white rice that soaked up every drop of that flavorful broth. It was Sunday-quality flavor, built from a throwaway cut, the kind of ingenuity that defined the tradition of making something wonderful out of almost nothing. The neck bones cost mere pennies, and the rice stretched the meal to feed a whole family generously. So a supper of real depth and comfort came together for next to no money at all. This was resourceful cooking, rooted in necessity and perfected over generations, turning the parts of the pig that others discarded into a beloved dish full of flavor and history. It remains a cherished comfort food in Southern and soul food traditions, though as neck bones grow harder to find and tastes change, the everyday home version has grown scarcer. Number 23, collard greens and pot liquor. If you understand this dish, you understand how the American South ate for the better part of 2 centuries. A big mess of collard greens, or turnip, or mustard greens was washed carefully and torn from the tough stems, then dropped into a pot with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock and just enough water to cover, and cooked low and slow for an hour or 2 until the greens wilted completely and turned meltingly soft. But the greens were only half of it. The dark, salty, mineral-rich liquid left in the bottom of the pot liquor, was not a byproduct to be poured off. It was the whole point, the essence of the greens and the cured pork concentrated into a deeply nourishing broth, the color of strong tea. Cornbread was baked specifically to be crumbled into that pot liquor and eaten with a spoon, soaking up every drop, while the tender greens were served alongside. Salt pork cost about 12 cents a pound, and a bunch of greens at a roadside stand was a dime. So this fed a family for almost nothing. Nutritionists now know that greens cooked this way retain remarkable amounts of calcium, iron, and folate, much of it dissolved into the very pot liquor that poor Southern families instinctively saved and treasured. They knew none of the science. They only knew it kept them strong, and they were right. Number 22, smothered pork chops. In Southern kitchens, this dish took the least expensive cut in the case and turned it into the best-smelling supper on the whole block. Cheap, thin pork chops, the kind that would turn dry and tough if simply fried, were seasoned, dredged in flour, and browned in a skillet, then buried, smothered in a rich onion gravy and simmered low and slow until they surrendered and turned fall-apart tender. The long braise in the gravy was the whole secret, transforming a tough, thin, inexpensive chop into something meltingly soft and deeply flavorful, while the gravy itself, made from the pan drippings and plenty of sweet cooked down onion, became the star of the plate. 2 chops smothered in gravy could stretch to feed 4, because the abundant gravy, poured over rice or mashed potatoes to catch every drop, did the work of extending a small amount of meat across the whole family. It was economical, satisfying, and full of comfort, the kind of dish that filled the house with an irresistible smell as it simmered. This was resourceful Southern home cooking at its finest, making a cheap cut taste like a feast through nothing but flour, onions, patience, and know-how. It remains a beloved staple of Southern and soul food cooking, though, as with so many of these dishes, the unhurried, from-scratch home version has grown less common in a hurried age. Number 21, Hoppin' John. In the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, this dish was tradition, superstition, and survival, all compressed into a single humble pot. Black-eyed peas were cooked with a smoked ham hock, onion, and seasoning until creamy and tender, then folded together with long-grain white rice and brightened with a pinch of red pepper, the rice soaking up the smoky, earthy broth from the peas until the two became one. Eaten on New Year's Day, it was said to bring good luck and prosperity for the year ahead, a tradition carried down through generations, but eaten on an ordinary Tuesday in the dead of winter, simply because there was nothing else in the house, it brought something even more essential: dinner. Black-eyed peas cost about 7 cents a pound in the 1950s, and rice was a cheap pantry staple, so a big pot of Hoppin' John fed a large family full for next to nothing, stretching a scrap of smoked pork and a handful of dried peas into a satisfying, nourishing meal. It carried the deep flavor of the South and the long history of the people who made it, a dish with roots reaching back through generations of low-country cooking. Rich, smoky, and comforting, it was survival food elevated by tradition and time. Today it appears on restaurant menus as a Southern specialty and on New Year's tables for luck, but as everyday fare, it has faded. Fourth pattern break. Here is what modern nutrition science has quietly confirmed. The families eating liver, hearts, tongue, neck bones, and pot liquor were not choking down poverty food. They were eating the most nutrient-dense parts of the whole animal, the organ meats and bones packed with iron, B12, zinc, collagen, and vitamins that muscle meat alone cannot match. Researchers studying traditional diets now call it nose-to-tail eating and sell it back to us at a premium. Our great-grandparents did it without a laboratory because wasting any part of an animal was unthinkable, and because the people who ate the whole beast simply worked harder and felt better. We did not get healthier when we started throwing the organs away. We got poorer in ways the grocery receipt never showed. The knowledge did not become wrong. It just became forgotten, and we paid for the forgetting with our health. Number 20, red beans and rice. This was the Monday supper of New Orleans, a dish born of tradition and thrift and cooked with a patience that suited the rhythm of the old wash day. Dried red kidney beans were cooked low and slow all day long with a smoked sausage link, onion, green pepper, celery, and seasoning simmering untended on the back of the stove while the household attended to the week's laundry. Over those long hours, the beans broke down and turned creamy, thickening the pot into something rich and velvety, while the smoked sausage gave up its garlicky, smoky soul into the whole thing. Served over a scoop of white rice, it was deeply flavorful, hearty and satisfying, and the best part was how little it demanded of the cook. You put the pot on and walked away, coming back hours later to find dinner had made itself. Under $3 produced a big pot so rich, so deeply flavored, and so filling that you completely forgot how little it had cost. It became the iconic Monday meal of the Crescent City, a ritual as much as a recipe, and Louis Armstrong loved it so dearly that he signed his letters, "Red beans and rice ally, yours." That was no joke. It was a man who never forgot where his food came from. It remains a cornerstone of Louisiana cooking, cherished and enduring. Number 19, pinto beans and cornbread. Across the mountains south, in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, this was not a side dish. This was the meal, the one that appeared on the table 5 or 6 nights a week in families who could not afford much else, and it built whole generations of coal miners and mill workers. A pot of dried pinto beans was started the night before, soaked, then simmered all day long with a ham hock or a piece of salt pork and seasoned with nothing more than salt and pepper. By supper time, the beans had broken down at the edges, thickening the pot liquor into a rich, dark, deeply savory broth that tasted nothing at all like the canned beans on a supermarket shelf. Meanwhile, a skillet of cast-iron cornbread baked golden while the beans simmered, and at the table you crumbled that cornbread directly into your bowl of beans and ate the two together from a single dish. The beans cost about 8 cents a pound, and the ham hock was a scrap the butcher nearly gave away, so this hearty, nourishing meal fed a large family for pennies. It was the food of hardworking people who never asked for anything fancy because they did not need fancy. They had this, and it sustained them through back-breaking labor and lean times alike. It remains beloved in Appalachia, honest and filling and true. Number 18, New England boiled dinner. This was the thrifty Yankee Sunday dinner, a one-pot meal that fed a crowd and then carried the family clear into the next week. A cut of corned beef or a ham, salty and inexpensive, was simmered slow in one big pot, along with an assortment of sturdy root vegetables and cabbage, potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, and often beets on the side, until everything turned tender and the whole thing perfumed the house. One pot, one fire, one meal, which mattered enormously in an age of wood stoves and coal ranges when heating multiple burners was a luxury of both fuel and effort. The meat flavored the vegetables as it cooked, and the modest cut stretched to feed a large family with plenty to spare. Best of all, the leftovers had a glorious second life. Chopped up and fried in a skillet the next morning, they became corned beef hash, or, with a beet added, the cheerful pink red flannel hash. Nothing was wasted, and a single afternoon's cooking yielded days of eating. It was the sturdy, sensible, economical supper of frugal New England households, rooted in the traditions of the region's earliest settlers and suited perfectly to the long, cold winters. Today it turns up mostly around St. Patrick's Day, but it was once the reliable anchor of the Yankee Week, humble and hearty and endlessly practical. Number 17, corned beef and cabbage. Cheap, salty, and forgiving, this was the dish that Irish-American families made every March for St. Patrick's Day, and on plenty of ordinary days besides, a hearty one-pot supper built for a tight budget. A tough, inexpensive cut of corned beef, cured beef brisket, was simmered low and slow for hours with cabbage and potatoes until the meat finally surrendered and turned fork tender, and the vegetables softened and drank up the savory, salty broth. The long, gentle cooking was the whole trick, breaking down a cut that would have been impossibly tough if rushed into something soft and rich. And one modest piece of corned beef perfumed and flavored a whole big pot of cabbage and potatoes, stretching a little meat across a large family. It was economical, filling, and deeply comforting, the kind of meal that warmed the house with its smell as it cooked and sent everyone away full. For Irish immigrants and their descendants, corned beef became the affordable American stand-in for the bacon of the old country, and the dish became bound up with heritage and celebration, though it was just as much an everyday thrift meal the rest of the year. It fed working-class families through hard times on the cheapest beef available. Today it survives largely as a holiday tradition, but it was once a reliable, humble supper cooked far more often than once a year. Number 16, ham steak with pineapple. This was the dish that looked like it came straight out of a glossy magazine spread, yet cost almost nothing, a little bit of mid-century glamour on a working family's budget. A thick slice of cured ham, often cut from the shank end or bought as a ready ham steak, was fried in a skillet until browned and heated through, and then the flourish that made it special. A ring or two of canned pineapple laid on top, sprinkled with brown sugar, and cooked until the sugar and pineapple juices bubbled and caramelized into a sweet, sticky glaze. That bright golden ring of fruit against the salty, smoky ham made a plain slice of pork feel like a genuine celebration, an occasion, something festive on an ordinary weeknight. Canned pineapple was cheap and kept forever on the shelf, and a ham steak stretched to feed the family, so the whole thing came together for very little money while looking far more impressive than it was. The sweet and salty combination was hugely popular in the post-war decades, when canned pineapple symbolized a certain modern, tropical sophistication that home cooks loved to bring to their tables. Served with mashed potatoes or scalloped potatoes and a vegetable, it was a complete, cheerful supper. It graced countless dinner tables through the 1950s and 60s, and today, that retro glazed ham steak has slipped from the everyday rotation into fond memory. Number 15, scalloped potatoes and ham. This was the clever, comforting dish that stretched the very last of Sunday's ham into a whole new meal part way through the week, wasting nothing and filling everyone. Thin sliced potatoes were layered in a baking dish with the bits and scraps of leftover ham scattered between them, then covered in a milk sauce, either a proper cream sauce or simply milk dotted with butter and flour, and baked slow until the potatoes turned tender, the sauce thickened and bubbled, and the top browned golden. As it baked, it filled the whole house with a rich, savory, irresistible smell, the kind that drew the family to the kitchen before it was even out of the oven. A little bit of ham, just the odds and ends left clinging to the bone, went a long way when layered through a whole dish of potatoes, and a bag of potatoes cost almost nothing, So this hearty casserole fed the entire family generously on the tail end of a ham that had already served its Sunday duty. It was thrift and comfort in a single bubbling dish. The creamy potatoes and salty ham, a perfect, satisfying pairing that felt indulgent despite its humble economy. It was a weeknight staple in households that never let good food go to waste. And today, though it still appears at holidays, the everyday version made from leftovers has grown less common. Number 14. Ham Low F. This was the resourceful cook's answer to the question of what to do with the ends and scraps of a ham that nothing else would use, and the answer was to grind them up and turn them into something handsome enough for company. Leftover ham was ground and mixed with a little ground pork to bind and enrich it, then combined with breadcrumbs, egg, and milk, pressed into a loaf pan, and baked with a sweet and tangy glaze of brown sugar and mustard brushed over the top, exactly like a meatloaf, but made from ham. The breadcrumbs stretched the meat, the glaze gave it a glistening, caramelized crust, and the whole thing sliced up neat and attractive, sweet and savory and studded with pink ham. It was cheap, using up bits of meat that would otherwise have been tossed, yet it looked and tasted special enough to serve to guests, which made it a favorite of thrifty hostesses. The sweet mustard glaze against the salty ham was irresistible, and it disappeared off the plate as fast as it hit the table. Pennsylvania Dutch and Midwestern kitchens especially loved it, and it appeared at church suppers, potlucks, and Sunday dinners across the heartland. It was economy disguised as an occasion, humble scraps elevated into something worth serving proudly. Today, the ham loaf has largely faded, remembered mostly in regional cookbooks and by the families who grew up on it. Number 15. Scalloped potatoes and ham. This was the clever, comforting dish that stretched the very last of Sunday's ham into a whole new meal partway through the week, wasting nothing and filling everyone. Thin sliced potatoes were layered in a baking dish with the Benson scraps of leftover ham scattered between them, then covered in a milk sauce, either a proper cream sauce or simply milk dotted with butter and flour, and baked slow until the potatoes turned tender. The sauce thickened and bubbled, and the top browned golden. As it baked, it filled the whole house with a rich, savory, irresistible smell, the kind that drew the family to the kitchen before it was even out of the oven. A little bit of ham, just the odds and ends left clinging to the bone, went a long way when layered through a whole dish of potatoes, and a bag of potatoes cost almost nothing, so this hearty casserole fed the entire family generously on the tail end of a ham that had already served its Sunday duty. It was thrift and comfort in a single bubbling dish, the creamy potatoes and salty ham, a perfect, satisfying pairing that felt indulgent despite its humble economy. It was a weeknight staple in households that never let good food go to waste. And today, though it still appears at holidays, the everyday version made from leftovers has grown less common. Number 14. Ham loaf. This was the resourceful cook's answer to the question of what to do with the ends and scraps of a ham that nothing else would use, and the answer was to grind them up and turn them into something handsome enough for company. Leftover ham was ground and mixed with a little ground pork to bind and enrich it, then combined with breadcrumbs, egg, and milk, pressed into a loaf pan, and baked with a sweet and tangy glaze of brown sugar and mustard brushed over the top, exactly like a meatloaf, but made from ham. The breadcrumbs stretched the meat, the glaze gave it a glistening, caramelized crust, and the whole thing sliced up neat and attractive, sweet and savory and studded with pink ham. It was cheap, using up bits of meat that would otherwise have been tossed, yet it looked and tasted special enough to serve to guests, which made it a favorite of thrifty hostesses. The sweet mustard glaze against the salty ham was irresistible, and it disappeared off the plate as fast as it hit the table. Pennsylvania Dutch and Midwestern kitchens especially loved it, and it appeared at church suppers, potlucks, and Sunday dinners across the heartland. It was economy disguised as an occasion, humble scraps elevated into something worth serving proudly. Today, the ham loaf has largely faded, remembered mostly in regional cookbooks and by the families who grew up on it. Number 13, chicken pot pie. This was the dish that turned the very last shreds of a Sunday chicken into a whole second supper, a small triumph of thrift wrapped in a flaky golden crust. Bits of leftover chicken, whatever could be picked from the carcass, were combined with vegetables, peas, carrots, onion, whatever was on hand, and bound in a creamy gravy made from the pan drippings or a bit of broth thickened with flour and milk. That savory filling went into a dish lined and topped with pastry, and the whole thing baked until the crust turned deep golden and flaky and the filling bubbled up rich beneath it. The genius of it was how little meat it actually required. A small amount of chicken, stretched by the vegetables and cloaked in plenty of creamy gravy, filled a whole pie that fed the entire family, and the crust made the humble contents feel like a genuine feast, even when the money was gone and the meat was nearly finished. It was warm, comforting, and satisfying, the kind of dish that made everyone at the table feel cared for and well-fed. Every family had its own version, some with a bottom crust, some with just a top, some with biscuits instead of pastry, but the spirit was always the same. Nothing wasted, everyone fed, comfort conjured from scraps. It endures, though far more often now from the freezer than from a Sunday carcass. Number 12, chicken à la king. This was the fancy-sounding dish that a thrifty cook could conjure out of a handful of leftover chicken and a can of soup, elegant enough for a lady's luncheon, yet cheap enough for an ordinary Tuesday supper. Diced cooked chicken was folded into a rich, creamy sauce, often built from a can of cream soup or a homemade white sauce, and studded with bright bits of pimento, green peas, and sometimes sautéed mushroom or green pepper for color and flavor. That luxurious creamed chicken got spooned generously over toast points, split biscuits, rice, or noodles, and the result looked and tasted far more sophisticated than its humble, economical origins suggested. The creamy sauce and the little flecks of red pimento gave it a certain elegance, a touch of refinement that made it a popular choice for entertaining, for bridge clubs and church luncheons and special occasions, even as it remained affordable enough for everyday family meals. A small amount of chicken, stretched by the sauce and the toast beneath, fed a whole table, which made it a favorite way to use up leftovers while still setting down something that felt special. It ruled American tables for decades, a staple of the mid-century hostess's repertoire and the frugal mother's rotation alike. Today it has slipped almost entirely from memory, a genteel, creamy relic of a bygone way of dining. Number 11, turkey tetrazzini. This was the genius dish that made the enormous, expensive Thanksgiving turkey last another full week, ensuring that not one shred of that costly bird ever went to waste. Leftover turkey meat, picked from the carcass, was folded together with cooked spaghetti or egg noodles, mushrooms, and a rich, creamy sauce, often built from cream and broth or a can of soup, then poured into a baking dish, topped with cheese and sometimes buttered breadcrumbs, and baked until bubbling and golden and the top crisped up. It was pure thrift dressed up as sophistication, a way to transform tired holiday leftovers into a comforting, substantial casserole that felt like a whole new meal rather than a reheating of the same old turkey. The creamy sauce and the pasta stretched a modest amount of leftover meat to feed the family again, wringing every last bit of value out of the bird that had already anchored the holiday feast. Named improbably for Luisa Tetrazzini, a famous Italian opera soprano of the early 20th century, it carried an air of elegance, despite being, at heart, a humble leftover casserole. It appeared on tables in the days and weeks after every Thanksgiving and Christmas, the reliable answer to the annual question of what to do with all that turkey. It remains a beloved leftover tradition, though fewer cooks now make the creamy sauce from scratch. Fifth pattern break. Here is where it stops being about money and starts being about the table itself. Every meal on this list was made for the same room, a kitchen where a family sat down together because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. There was no television in the corner and no phone in anyone's hand. There was a pot in the middle and a circle of faces around it, and the food, however cheap, was the reason everyone was there. That is the thing we actually forgot. Not the recipes, though we forgot those too. We forgot the table. We traded the pot roast and the pinto beans for drive-thrus and separate schedules and dinners eaten standing up, and we told ourselves it was progress. These meals were never just about feeding a family. They were the reason a family gathered at all. That is what vanished, and that is what these last dishes were built to bring back. Number 10, smothered chicken and gravy. In Southern kitchens, this was the dish whose smell meant home, a deeply comforting supper that turned one cheap chicken into a meal that fed the whole table twice. A cut-up chicken was seasoned, dredged in flour and browned in a skillet, then buried, smothered, in a rich onion gravy and simmered low and slow until the meat fell tender off the bone and the gravy turned thick and savory with all the flavor of the chicken and the sweet cooked down onions. Served over a bed of white rice to catch every drop of that abundant gravy, it was hearty, satisfying, and soul-warming, the kind of meal that filled the house with an irresistible aroma as it simmered on the stove. The gravy was the great stretcher, extending a modest chicken across a large family so that everyone ate their fill and there was enough left for a second night. One cheap bird and a skillet full of gravy became days of comfort, which is exactly the kind of economy that defined the best of Southern home cooking. It was resourceful and generous at once, making a little go a long way while never skimping on flavor or comfort. This was Sunday quality food made from Tuesday's budget, the reliable centerpiece of countless Southern family suppers, and it remains a treasured staple of soul food and Southern cooking, though the unhurried homemade version grows rarer. Number 9, baked chicken and rice. This was the ultimate set-it-and-forget-it supper, the dish a busy mother could throw together in a single dish and walk away from, confident it would come out golden and perfect every single time. Chicken pieces, seasoned simply, were laid over a bed of raw white rice in a baking dish, and then a can of cream of mushroom soup and a can of broth or water were poured over the top, sometimes with a sprinkle of dry onion soup mix for extra flavor. The dish was covered tightly and baked slow in the oven, and as it cooked, the rice drank up every bit of the flavorful liquid and the juices from the chicken, turning tender and creamy and infused with savory richness, while the chicken on top browned and turned succulent. You dumped everything in, covered it, and got on with your day, and it never once failed, which is exactly why it became such a beloved weeknight standby for the harried post-war family. It required almost no skill, no watching, and no expensive ingredients, just a cheap chicken, some rice, and a can of soup. Yet it produced a complete, hearty, deeply comforting one-dish meal that fed the whole family. It was the very picture of mid-century convenience cooking at its most reliable and satisfying, and it fed countless households through the decades. Today it lives on in church cookbook nostalgia and the memories of those raised on it. Number 8. Fried chicken. Sunday dinner. The whole week pointed toward this, the crowning meal that announced the family had made it through another 7 days of labor and worry, and it tasted like Sunday itself. A chicken was cut into pieces and soaked in buttermilk to tenderize it and season it deep, then dredged in seasoned flour and fried in a cast iron skillet, often in lard or shortening, until the crust turned deep golden brown and shatteringly crisp, while the meat inside stayed juicy and tender. Alongside came mashed potatoes and a rich gravy made from the crusty drippings in the bottom of the pan, plus whatever the garden was giving that season: green beans, corn, sliced tomatoes, biscuits. It was the most special meal of the ordinary week, the one reserved for after church, for company, for the day of rest. A spread that felt abundant and celebratory even in households that scrimped and stretched the other 6 days. The chicken itself, often one the family had raised, was a cause for gathering, and the smell of it frying filled the house and drew everyone in. It was more than food. It was ritual, reward, and the taste of family and home all at once, the meal that said the hard work had been worth it. Fried chicken endures as an American icon, but the Sunday dinner ritual around it, the whole family gathered, has largely faded. Number 7. Shepherd's pie. This was the humble genius of the leftover kitchen, a way to turn Monday's scraps into a whole comforting supper that asked for nothing you did not already have on hand. Bits of leftover cooked meat, whatever was around, along with vegetables and a savory gravy to bind them, were spread in the bottom of a baking dish, then capped with a thick, generous layer of mashed potatoes spread right to the edges. The whole thing was baked until the potato top turned golden brown and crisp, and the gravy bubbled up around the sides. It was cheap, warm, and complete in one dish, the kind of meal that fed a family from the very bottom of the refrigerator, using up odds and ends that might otherwise have gone to waste and transforming them into something hearty and satisfying. The mashed potato crust made the modest filling feel abundant, and the gravy tied it all into pure comfort. Originally a British and Irish dish made with lamb in its purest form, or beef when it was called cottage pie, it crossed the ocean and became a beloved American way to stretch leftovers into a filling, economical supper. It required no fresh shopping, no special ingredients, just the thrifty instinct to waste nothing and the knowledge that a layer of mashed potatoes could turn scraps into a feast. It remains a comfort food classic, though fewer cooks now build it from genuine leftovers. Number 6. Tater tot hottish. This is the church basement legend of the upper Midwest, the dish that fed funerals, potlucks, fundraisers, and ordinary Tuesday night suppers alike, and nothing said Minnesota family love quite like a pan of it coming out of the oven. The formula was simple and beloved. Browned ground beef spread in the bottom of a big pan, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and some frozen vegetables layered over it, and then the crowning glory, a neat, complete layer of frozen tater tots arranged across the top, baked until the tots turned crisp and golden brown, and the creamy filling bubbled up beneath them. It was cheap, it was easy, it fed a crowd, and it required nothing but pantry and freezer staples, which made it the reigning champion of communal Midwestern cooking, the dish that appeared at every gathering where people needed feeding. In Minnesota and the Dakotas, the word hot dish itself is practically a cultural institution, and this tater tot version is its most famous ambassador, a warm, comforting, unpretentious casserole that speaks of church suppers and neighborly kindness and family gathered around a folding table. The crisp tots on top against the creamy, beefy filling below made it irresistible, especially to children. It fed generations of families and communities through good times and grief alike. Always reliable, always comforting. It remains a genuine regional icon, still made and still beloved, one of the few dishes on this list that never went away. Number 5, chicken and dumplings. This was the meal that appeared whenever someone was sick in bed, whenever grief settled over a household, whenever a neighbor needed comfort or a heart needed mending. The dish that said, without words, that someone still cared enough to cook for you. A stewing hen, old and tough and cheap, was simmered for hours until the meat fell tender off the bone and the broth turned deep and golden and rich. Then spoonfuls of biscuit dough, flour, baking powder, salt, and milk were dropped directly into the bubbling broth, where they puffed up into soft, pillowy, tender dumplings that absorbed the chicken flavor from the inside out as they cooked. The whole pot thickened into something between a soup and a stew, hearty and soul-warming, the very essence of comfort food. It cost little, built as it was on a cheap old bird and a few pantry staples, yet a single big pot lasted a family nearly a week and only seemed to deepen in comfort each time it was reheated. Southern grandmothers made it for the grieving and the ailing and the merely tired, carrying it in covered pots to doorsteps across the neighborhood, and every bowl carried the message that someone loved you enough to make it. It was care made edible, warmth you could hold in your hands. It endures as one of the most beloved comfort foods in America, the taste of being taken care of. Number 4, beef stew. This was patience turned into supper, the dish that took the toughest, cheapest cut in the whole store and, given nothing but time, transformed it into something tender and rich and deeply satisfying. Cheap chuck was cut into chunks, browned hard in a heavy pot to build flavor, then simmered low and slow for hours with potatoes, carrots, onions, and a rich broth until the meat surrendered completely and turned fork tender and the whole house filled with a smell like Sunday. The long, gentle cooking was everything, breaking down the tough connective tissue of the inexpensive cut into melting softness, while the vegetables absorbed the savory broth, and the whole thing thickened into a hearty, warming stew. One big pot fed the family for days, and like all the best of these dishes, it only got better on the second and third night, the flavors deepening and marrying as it sat. It cost almost nothing, built on the cheapest beef and the humblest root vegetables, yet it delivered comfort and substance in abundance, the kind of meal that warmed a body through on the coldest night and sent everyone away full and content. It was resourceful, forgiving, and endlessly reliable, the reward for a cook willing to let time do the work that money could not. Beef stew never truly went out of style, but the slow, unhurried, from-scratch pot has grown rare in a hurried world that forgot how to wait. Number 3, Sunday pot roast. This was the anchor of the entire American week, the meal everyone came home for, the one that meant family and rest, and the reward at the end of 6 hard days. A tough, cheap chuck roast, the kind that would be inedible if rushed, was seared hard to brown it and then braised low and slow for hours with potatoes, carrots, and onions until it fell apart at the touch of a fork and the vegetables turned soft and savory in the rich, meaty juices. Often it went into the oven or onto the back of the stove before the family left for church on Sunday morning, cooking away untended for hours, so that when they walked back through the door, the whole house was filled with its deep, welcoming smell, and dinner was nearly ready. The long braise was the magic, transforming the cheapest, toughest cut into something tender and luxurious for a fraction of the price of a proper roast. And one modest piece of beef, surrounded by potatoes and carrots that stretched the meal, fed the whole family with leftovers for sandwiches and hash besides. It was economy and abundance at once, the humble made majestic through patience. But more than that, it was the centerpiece of the week's most important gathering, the Sunday dinner that drew the whole family to one table. It was the meal everyone remembered, and its slow fading marks the fading of that gathering itself. Number 2, pork chops and applesauce. This was the cheap, no-fuss family supper that lived on television screens and real kitchen tables alike. The everyday dinner so ordinary and so beloved that it became a kind of shorthand for wholesome family life itself. Thin, inexpensive pork chops were seasoned and fried in a skillet until browned and cooked through, and served with a simple spoonful of applesauce on the side, the cool, sweet apple playing against the salty, savory pork in a pairing that somehow felt exactly right. There was nothing complicated about it, no long braise, no special technique, no expensive ingredients, just 2 chops and a jar of applesauce. And yet it made a plain Tuesday feel like enough, feel like a proper family dinner. Applesauce was cheap and kept forever on the pantry shelf, and thin chops were among the most affordable cuts of pork, so the whole meal came together fast and cheap and reliable, the perfect answer for a busy mother on an ordinary weeknight. The sweet and savory combination was a genuine classic, comforting and satisfying in its very simplicity, and it appeared on countless American tables through the mid-century decades. Immortalized in a famous television impression of the era, it became emblematic of the simple, sturdy family supper, the kind of meal that asked nothing and gave comfort. It fed families cheaply and happily for generations, and today, though the pairing endures, the everyday ritual of it has quietly faded. Number 1, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. At the very top of this list sits the most American family dinner there ever was, the humble, beloved meal that fed the nation through good times and hard ones, and became the very definition of home. A single pound of ground beef was stretched with bread soaked in milk, a beaten egg, and a chopped onion, all of it mixed together and pressed into a loaf pan, glazed with a slick of ketchup or tomato sauce across the top, and baked in the oven while a pot of potatoes boiled on the stove for mashing. The bread and the fillers were the thrift, extending a modest amount of cheap meat into a loaf that fed the whole family, and the leftovers, sliced cold, made sandwiches for the next day's lunch, wasting nothing. It cost almost nothing to make, yet no dish was ever more humble or more loved, more universally cooked across every kind of American household. It was on the table in coal towns and post-war suburbs, in ranch kitchens and city tenements, in farmhouses and apartments, the great common denominator of the American supper. It was the meal that said, no matter how tight the money was that week, no matter how hard the times, the family would still gather around the table and eat something warm and good together tonight. It was never fancy, and it never needed to be because it was something better than fancy. It was the taste of being home. Here's the challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The pot roast, the pinto beans and cornbread, the chicken and dumplings, or the meatloaf your grandmother made without a second thought. Then, sit down at the table, set a real place, and eat it slow. Drop the one you are going to make in the comments. I want to know if the meatloaf gets more love than the pot roast, and whether anybody else's grandmother made tomato gravy over biscuits. Because these were never just cheap dinners, they were the reason a family gathered at all. Your grandparents knew that. Now you do too.